I am just a chronicler and welcome you to another video. Since I know many of you watch to relax and fall asleep, I thought it would be nice if you left a comment telling me where you're listening from and if it's raining there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Now, it's time to get comfortable, relax, and begin. The photographs were the first sign that our romantic getaway was about to become a nightmare. But by the time we realized the danger we were in, it was already too late to escape. I remembered the excitement I felt as Sarah and I drove up the winding mountain road, our small car packed with a weekend's worth of supplies. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns on the road. Sarah's hand rested on my thigh as I navigated the sharp turns, her touch a constant reminder of why we'd decided to get away from it all. "There it is," Sarah exclaimed, pointing through the windshield. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, its framed silhouette a stark contrast against the lush green backdrop. It was more rustic than I'd expected, weathered wood siding and a steep roof that disappeared into the surrounding pines. Perfect for a weekend of solitude and reconnection. I pulled up to the small clearing that served as a parking area and cut the engine. The silence was immediate and absolute. No traffic, no city noises, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. Sarah stretched as she got out of the car, her smile radiant in the golden hour light. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. I couldn't help but agree as I grabbed our bags from the trunk. The stress of our busy lives seemed to melt away with each step towards the cabin. The key was exactly where the rental agent said it would be, tucked under a fake rock by the front door. As I turned it in the lock, I felt a momentary chill, like someone had walked over my grave. I shook it off, chalking it up to the cooler temperature at this elevation. The interior of the cabin was cozy, all knotty pine and rustic charm. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a plush-looking sofa facing it. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, and a narrow staircase led up to what I assumed was the bedroom loft. "Let's open some windows," Sarah suggested, already moving to do so. "It's a bit stuffy in here." I nodded, dropping our bags and heading to the opposite side of the room. As I pushed up the sash on a window, something fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up, thinking it was just a scrap of paper. It was a photograph. The image was grainy and slightly faded, but clear enough to make out the details. It showed a man, his face contorted in terror, bound to a chair in what looked like this very room. My blood ran cold as I took in the details. The same stone fireplace, the same window I'd just opened. "Sarah," I called, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Come look at this." She crossed the room, her brow furrowed at my tone. When she saw the photo, her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is that?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. That's when I noticed another photo, partially hidden under the edge of the sofa, and another peeking out from behind a dusty picture frame on the mantel. With growing dread, we began to search the cabin. Everywhere we looked, we found more photographs. Some were hidden, tucked into drawers or slipped between the pages of books. Others were in plain sight, as if daring us to look. Each image was more horrifying than the last. People bound, beaten, their faces masks of pain and fear, and all of them seemed to have been taken right here in this cabin. In the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom upstairs. It was like walking through a gallery of torture and suffering. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Right now." I couldn't have agreed more. We practically ran for the door, leaving our bags behind in our haste to escape. But when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The key that had worked perfectly just an hour ago now spun uselessly in the lock. "The windows," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. But each one we tried was stuck fast, as if they'd been painted shut. Even the one I'd opened earlier refused to budge. That's when we heard the first rumble of thunder. Outside, the sky had darkened ominously, heavy clouds rolling in with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows in their frames. We watched in horror as a massive pine tree, uprooted by the gale, came crashing down across the only road leading away from the cabin. In the span of minutes, we'd gone from planning a relaxing weekend to being trapped in what felt increasingly like a house of horrors. The storm raged through the night, its fury matching the turmoil of our emotions. We huddled together on the sofa, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin's old timbers. The photographs seemed to watch us from every corner, their silent screams a constant reminder of the atrocities that had taken place here. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, we finally succumbed to exhaustion. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke with a start, every nerve in my body screaming danger. The cabin was silent, too silent. The storm had passed, but something felt profoundly wrong. Sarah was no longer beside me on the sofa. "Sarah," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. There was no response. I got up, my legs shaky from fear and lack of sleep. That's when I saw it. A new photograph on the coffee table. My heart nearly stopped as I picked it up with trembling hands. It showed Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, bound to a chair in the cabin's basement. A basement I hadn't even known existed until that moment. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I had to find her. I had to get us out of here. I searched frantically for any sign of a hidden door or trapdoor that might lead to a basement. It was in the kitchen that I finally found it, a nearly invisible seam in the floorboards that, when pressed, revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight as I made my way down, guided only by the weak light from my phone. The basement was a large, open space, filled with shadows that seemed to move at the edge of my vision. And there, in the center of the room, was Sarah. She was exactly as she'd appeared in the photograph, tied to a chair, her face a mask of fear. But her eyes widened when she saw me, a mixture of relief and renewed terror. "Behind you," she screamed. I spun around, just in time to see a figure lunging at me from the darkness. I caught a glimpse of wild eyes and a face twisted into a grotesque smile, before I was knocked to the ground, my phone skittering away across the concrete floor. The struggle was brief but violent. My attacker was strong, but desperation lent me strength I didn't know I possessed. Somehow, I managed to break free and scrambled towards where I'd last seen my phone. My fingers closed around it just as a hand grabbed my ankle, trying to drag me back. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I twisted around and swung the phone as hard as I could. There was a sickening crunch as it connected with my attacker's head, and suddenly I was free. I didn't waste a second. I ran to Sarah, my shaking hands fumbling with the ropes that bound her. As soon as she was free, we bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time in our desperation to escape. We burst out of the cabin into the bright morning light, gasping for air. The storm had left a path of destruction, fallen trees, scattered debris, but in that moment, It looked like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We ran to the car, praying that it would start. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, not caring about the branches and leaves that scratched at the paint. As we maneuvered around the fallen tree blocking the road, it wasn't until we were miles away, the cabin long out of sight, that we finally allowed ourselves to break down. Sarah sobbed in the passenger seat, and I realized I was crying too, the adrenaline giving way to delayed shock and terror. We drove straight to the nearest police station, our stories spilling out in a jumbled rush. They were skeptical at first, but something in our eyes, in the raw fear that still clung to us, convinced them to investigate. They found the cabin just as we'd described it, the photographs scattered throughout like a gruesome scavenger hunt. But of our attacker, there was no sign. Just a basement room equipped for torture, and a trail of blood leading into the woods. In the days and weeks that followed, as the police investigation unfolded, we learned the horrible truth. The cabin had been the site of a series of unsolved disappearances stretching back decades. Our attacker, we were told, was likely the latest in a line of killers who had used the remote location for their twisted purposes. They never found him. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I imagine him out there in the woods, waiting for his next victims. Other times, I hope that his injuries were severe enough that he never made it out alive. Sarah and I, we tried to move on. We went to therapy, individually and as a couple. We moved to a new city, hoping for a fresh start. But the memories of that night in the cabin never fully faded. Even now, years later, I can't look at a photograph without feeling a chill run down my spine. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right outside our window, I'm transported back to that night, trapped in a cabin filled with the echoes of past horrors, never quite sure if we're truly safe. Story 2. The darkness of the ocean depths had always been my sanctuary. But on that fateful dive, I discovered that even the darkest waters can hide secrets that should never see the light of day. My name's Jack, and I've been an underwater welder for the better part of a decade. It's a job that demands nerves of steel and a comfort with isolation that most people can't fathom. But for me, the silent world beneath the waves has always felt like home. That morning started like any other. I suited up on the deck of our support vessel, the salt air filling my lungs as I ran through my equipment checks. My dive partner, Mike, was laid up with a nasty case of the flu, so I was flying solo on this one. It was just a routine inspection of some offshore pipelines. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. As I descended into the murky depths, the familiar sense of calm washed over me. The only sounds were the steady hiss of my breathing apparatus and the occasional crackle of comms from the surface team. The water grew colder and darker with each passing meter, until the only illumination came from the powerful lamp affixed to my helmet. I was about halfway through my inspection when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow at the edge of my light's beam, something that didn't quite fit with the featureless seafloor I'd been surveying. Curiosity got the better of me, and I signaled to the surface that I was going to investigate. As I approached, the shadow took shape. The barnacle-encrusted hull of a ship emerged from the gloom, its once-proud lines now broken and twisted by the unforgiving sea. It wasn't unusual to stumble across wrecks out here, but something about this one made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Surface, this is Jack," I called over the comms. "I've found some kind of shipwreck down here. Doesn't look like it's on any of our charts." There was a burst of static. Then the dive supervisor's voice came through. "Roger that, Jack. How old are we talking?" I swam closer, my light playing over the ship's rusted flanks. "Hard to say. Looks old, but I trailed off as something caught my eye. There, half buried in the silt, was what looked like a modern diving helmet. That can't be right, I muttered to myself. What's that, Jack? The supervisor asked. Nothing, I replied quickly, just thinking out loud. I'm going to take a closer look. I should have turned back right then. Should have reported the wreck and let the proper authorities handle it. But there's a reason people like me do this job. We're not exactly known for our caution. As I approached the ship's gaping hold, I noticed something odd. The metal around the opening wasn't jagged or torn like you'd expect from a wreck. It looked cut, clean and precise, like someone had used an underwater torch to carve their way in. My unease grew, but so did my curiosity. I squeezed through the opening, my bulky welding gear scraping against the edges. The interior was a maze of twisted metal and silk-covered debris. But as my light swept across the hold, I realized something wasn't right. There were patches where the silt had been disturbed recently. And was that a boot print? A chill that had nothing to do with the frigid water ran down my spine. "Surface," I called, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I think someone's been down here." Recently, there was a long pause before the supervisor's voice came back, tight with concern. "Jack, I want you to exit that wreck immediately. We're aborting the dive." I was about to comply when a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something had darted just out of my light's reach. "Hold on," I said, more to myself than to the surface team. "I think there's something." The words died in my throat as my lamp illuminated a face. A human face, pale and gaunt, staring at me from the shadows of the wreck. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. There was no way anyone could survive down here without gear. But then the face moved, mouth opening in what might have been a silent scream, and I realized with horror that it was all too real. I recoiled, my back slamming against the hull. The impact sent a cloud of silt billowing up, momentarily obscuring my vision. When it cleared, the face was gone. But I could hear something moving in the darkness beyond my light's reach. Something that shouldn't be there. Panic seized me. I turned to flee, but in my haste, I snagged my air hose on a piece of jagged metal. I yanked it free, but the precious seconds it cost me were enough. A hand, pale, wrinkled, and impossibly strong, clamped down on my ankle. I kicked out blindly, my foot connecting with something solid. The grip loosened, and I shot towards the opening I'd entered through. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of pursuit, a scraping, slithering noise that didn't sound human at all. "Surface," I yelled into my cum. "Emergency ascent. Something's down here. Something's chasing me." I burst out of the wreck's hold, kicking for the surface with every ounce of strength I had left. The dive supervisor was shouting something in my ear, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my own panicked breathing. As I ascended, I risked a glance downward. My blood ran cold at what I saw. Multiple figures were emerging from the wreck, their movements unnaturally fluid in the water. Their faces, when caught in the beam of my light, were a nightmarish blend of human and something else. Fish-like eyes bulged from sunken sockets, and what I had first taken for pale skin was actually covered in fine, iridescent scales. I've never ascended so fast in my life. I knew I was risking the bends, but in that moment, decompression sickness seemed like a small price to pay to escape whatever horrors lurked below. As I neared the surface, a terrible thought struck me. What if they followed me up? What if I was leading these things? straight to the ship and my unsuspecting crew. But when I finally broke the surface, gasping and spluttering, there was no sign of pursuit. The support vessel's crew hauled me aboard, their faces etched with concern. I babbled about what I'd seen, pointing wildly at the calm waters below, but there was nothing to see, just the endless blue of the ocean, betraying none of the secrets it held in its depths. The next few days were a blur of medical checks and debriefings. The company brought in experts to analyze the data from my dive computer and the camera mounted on my helmet. They found evidence of the wreck, just as I'd described it, but of the inhabitants I'd encountered, there was no sign. The grainy footage showed only shadows and silt clouds, nothing that could corroborate my wild tale. I heard the whispers, of course, how the pressure must have gotten to me, how the isolation of the deep can play tricks on a diver's mind. Some even suggested that I'd fabricated the whole thing to cover up some mistake I'd made during the dive. But I know what I saw down there. In my dreams, I still see those pale, twisted faces emerging from the darkness. I still feel that inhuman grip on my ankle, trying to drag me back into the depths. I've been on dry land for months now, unable to bring myself to go back into the water. The company has been understanding, offering me a desk job until I recover. But how do you recover from something like that? How do you go back to normal when you've seen proof that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than you ever imagined? Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out at the ocean, wondering about that wreck and its unearthly inhabitants. Are they still down there, waiting in the darkness? Did they once walk on land like us, only to be changed by whatever forces lurk in the ocean's deepest trenches? Or are they something that was never human to begin with, using that ship as a gateway into our world? I don't know if I'll ever find the answers. Part of me hopes I never do. But another part, the part that drove me to explore the depths in the first place, can't help but wonder. And sometimes, when the call of the sea becomes too strong to ignore, I find myself looking at my old diving gear, contemplating one last descent into the abyss, because the ocean keeps its secrets well. But once you've glimpsed what lies beneath the surface, it's impossible to look away. The darkness calls, and sooner or later, I know I'll have to answer. Story 3. The crystal clear waters of the Bahamas were supposed to be our playground. Instead, they became our prison, with death lurking just beneath the surface. I still remember the excitement in Mia's eyes as we climbed onto those jet skis. The sun was high, the sky a perfect blue, and the ocean stretched out before us like an endless playground. We were 2 days into our vacation, and this was meant to be the highlight, a chance to feel the wind in our hair and the spray of the sea on our faces. "Race you to that buoy," Mia shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the jet ski's engine. She took off like a shot, leaving me laughing and scrambling to catch up. We spent the next hour zigzagging across the waves, marveling at how the water changed color from turquoise to deep blue as we ventured further from the shore. It was exhilarating, feeling so free and untethered. Looking back, I realized that was our first mistake. Not paying attention to how far we'd strayed from the safety of the tourist beaches. It was Mia who spotted it first. "Hey, Jake," she called out, pointing to our left. "What do you think that is?" I followed her gaze and saw a cluster of small islands in the distance, their shores hidden behind a screen of mangroves. But what caught my attention was the group of boats anchored in a sheltered cove. "Probably just some locals having a party," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt a twinge of unease. The boats were too sleek, too expensive looking for a casual get-together. Mia, ever the adventurer, was already steering her jet ski towards the cove.
"Come on,"
she called over her shoulder.
"Let's check it out."
I hesitated for a moment, but the allure of discovery won out over my caution. We approached slowly, the sound of our engines seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness of the cove. As we drew closer, the details came into focus. The boats were high-end speedboats, the kind you'd see in a James Bond movie, and the men on board. They didn't look like they were there for a good time. They moved with a purposeful efficiency, passing crates and duffel bags between the boats. That's when one of them spotted us. He straightened up suddenly, his hand moving to his waist in a way that made my heart skip a beat. I locked eyes with Mia, saw the same realization dawning on her face. We'd stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. "Turn around," I mouthed her, already swinging my jet ski in a wide arc. But it was too late. The roar of engines filled the air as two of the speedboats detached from the group, heading straight for us. Panic surged through me as I opened the throttle wide, urging the jet ski to its top speed. "Go, go, go," I shouted to Mia, who was right beside me. The wind whipped my words away, but I saw her nod, her face a mask of determination and fear. We raced out of the cove, the speedboats in hot pursuit. I risked a glance back and my blood ran cold. These weren't just any boats. They were built for speed and stealth. Probably custom jobs for whatever illegal operation we'd interrupted. And they were gaining on us. The next few minutes were a blur of spray and terror. We weaved between small islands and coral outcroppings, trying to use the shallow waters to our advantage. But our pursuers were skilled, matching our every move. A sharp crack split the air, and a plume of water erupted just meters to my left. They were shooting at us. The reality of our situation hit me like a physical blow. These men weren't trying to scare us off. They were trying to eliminate us. "Head for the shore," I yelled to Mia, pointing towards a strip of beach in the distance. It was our only chance. If we could make it to land, maybe we could lose them in the trees or find help. We pushed our jet skis to their limits, the engines whining in protest. The beach grew tantalizingly close, but so did the sound of our pursuers. Another shot rang out, this one closer. I heard Mia cry out and my heart nearly stopped, but when I looked over, she was still upright, still moving. We were less than 100 meters from the shore when disaster struck. Mia's jet ski hit something underwater, a submerged log or a reef, and flipped violently. I watched in horror as she was thrown clear, hitting the water with a splash. There was no time to think. I swung my jet ski around, my eyes scanning the choppy surface for any sign of her. Seconds stretched into an eternity before I saw her head break the surface, gasping for air. I pulled up alongside her, reaching out to grab her arm. "Come on," I shouted, hauling her onto the back of my jet ski. She scrambled to hold on, coughing and sputtering. The speedboats were almost upon us now. I could see the grim faces of the men on board, could almost feel their eyes on us as they took aim. With Mia's added weight, the jet ski responded sluggishly, but I pushed it for all it was worth. We hit the shallows hard, the jet ski's hull scraping against the sandy bottom. The moment we were close enough, we leapt off and ran for the tree line, the sound of engines and shouting at our backs. The dense vegetation swallowed us up, branches whipping at our faces as we ran blindly inland. Behind us, I could hear the speedboats beaching themselves, followed by the sound of feet pounding on sand. "We need to split up," Mia gasped between breaths. It'll make it harder for them to track us. I wanted to argue, to keep her close where I could protect her, but she was right. We had a better chance of at least one of us surviving if we separated. Okay, I nodded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Head north if you can. Try to find a road or a town. I'll go south and try to draw them off. Mia grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. Be careful, she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and then she was gone, disappearing into the undergrowth. I took a moment to orient myself, then started running south. I could hear our pursuers crashing through the forest behind me, getting closer by the second. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green maze. At some point, I realized I couldn't hear anyone behind me anymore, but I didn't dare stop. The forest eventually gave way to a rocky coastline, and I found myself scrambling over boulders, always keeping the ocean to my right. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I finally allowed myself to slow down. My body was screaming in protest, every muscle aching from the prolonged flight. I collapsed behind a large rock, trying to catch my breath and figure out what to do next. That's when I heard it, the distant thrum of an engine. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought our pursuers had found me. But as the sound grew closer, I realized it was coming from the water. I peered around the rock and nearly wept with relief. It was a Coast Guard vessel, its lights flashing as it patrolled the shoreline. I stumbled out onto the beach, waving my arms frantically and shouting until my voice was hoarse. The boat turned towards me, and minutes later I was being hauled aboard, wrapped in a blanket as I babbled my story to the bewildered crew. The next few days were a whirlwind of police interviews and hospital checks. They found Mia, thank God. She had managed to flag down a car on a coastal road and was already talking to the authorities when they brought me in. The cove where it all started was empty by the time the police got there, of course. But they found evidence of recent activity. Tire tracks on the beach, discarded fuel canisters, and traces of drugs in the water. It was enough to launch a major investigation, though we were told not to expect much. These kinds of operations were notoriously difficult to pin down. Mia and I spent the rest of our vacation under police protection in a nondescript hotel, jumping at every sudden noise and flinching at the sight of any boat on the water. When we finally boarded our flight home, it felt like escaping all over again. We try not to talk about that day much anymore. But sometimes, when we're together and the conversation lulls, I'll catch Mia staring out at the horizon with a faraway look in her eyes. And I know she's thinking about it too, about how quickly paradise can turn into a nightmare and how the brightest waters can hide the darkest secrets. I haven't been on a jet ski since that day. Haven't even been in the ocean, if I'm being honest. But every now and then, I'll see an ad for a tropical vacation, all pristine beaches and crystal clear waters. And for a split second, before the memories come flooding back, I'll feel that old excitement stirring. Because that's the thing about the ocean. No matter how dangerous it can be, there's always a part of you that longs to go back in. Story 4. The pristine slopes of Aspen were supposed to be our winter wonderland. Instead, they became a frozen hell where every shadow held a secret and every smile masked the threat. I'll never forget the moment we arrived at the Silver Pine Lodge. My wife, Karen, and our kids, Tommy and Lisa, pressed their faces against the car windows, eyes wide with wonder at the snow-capped mountains looming around us. The lodge itself was a masterpiece of rustic luxury, all exposed beams and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the blindingly white landscape. "This is going to be the best vacation ever," Tommy exclaimed as we piled out of the car, our breath forming little clouds in the crisp mountain air. If only I'd known then how wrong he would be. The first couple of days were everything we'd hoped for. We hit the slopes early each morning, Karen and I patiently guiding the kids as they got their ski legs under them. By the afternoon of the second day, Tommy was already tackling some of the intermediate runs, while Lisa was content to stick to the bunny slopes with Karen. It was on the third day that things started to feel off. I'd decided to try one of the more challenging Black Diamond runs, while the rest of the family stuck to the easier slopes. The run was exhilarating, the powder perfect as I carved my way down the mountain. But about halfway down, I hit a patch of ice that shouldn't have been there. My skis went out from under me, and I found myself tumbling head over heels down the slope. When I finally came to a stop, my heart pounding and every muscle screaming, I looked back up at where I'd fallen. The ice patch was gone. In its place was nothing but pristine powder. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the fall had rattled me more than I thought. But as I made my way down the rest of the run, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Back at the lodge that evening, I overheard a couple at the next table talking in hushed tones about a nasty fall they'd had on one of the intermediate runs. It was the strangest thing, the woman was saying. One minute we were cruising along, the next it was like the snow just gave way under us. I tried to push the unease aside, focusing instead on my family's excited chatter about their day. But that night, as I lay awake listening to the wind howl outside our window, the doubts crept back in. The next morning, we decided to try a family run together. We chose a nice, easy blue run, perfect for Lisa to practice on. Everything was going great until we rounded a bend and found ourselves faced with a section of trail that was decidedly not blue-level difficulty. Rough moguls and steep drops had appeared as if out of nowhere. "This can't be right," Karen said, her voice tight with concern. The trail map didn't show anything like this. Before we could decide what to do, Lisa lost control on a mogul and went sliding towards the edge of the trail. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw her heading straight for a cluster of trees. At the last second, she managed to dig her ski edges in and come to a stop, but it was far too close for comfort. As we gathered around Lisa, making sure she was okay, I noticed one of the ski patrol members watching us from the tree line. There was something off about the way he was standing, too still, his face hidden in the shadow of his helmet. When he saw me looking, he turned and disappeared into the trees with unsettling speed. That night, I couldn't shake my unease. While Karen and the kids watched a movie in our suite, I headed down to the lodge's main desk, determined to get some answers. The night manager, a thin man with a permanent smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, listened politely as I voiced my concerns about the trail conditions. But his responses were all platitudes and afflictions. "I assure you, sir, our trails are meticulously maintained," he said, that plastic smile never wavering. "Perhaps you and your family are just finding the altitude a bit challenging." I was about to argue further when I noticed something behind the desk. A monitor, partially obscured by a stack of papers, showed a view of the ski slopes. But it wasn't a live feed. The time stamp in the corner was from 3 days ago. And as I watched, I saw a group of skiers on a trail that I knew for a fact had been closed all week due to avalanche risk. The night manager noticed my gaze and quickly adjusted the papers to block the screen. "Is there anything else I can help you with, sir?" he asked, an edge creeping into his voice. I mumbled something about needing to get back to my family and retreated to our room, my mind racing. What the hell was going on in this place? The next day, I convinced Karen to take the kids to the indoor pool, while I did some investigating. I told her I wasn't feeling well. Not entirely a lie, given the knot of anxiety that had taken up residence in my stomach. I started by chatting up some of the other guests, casually bringing up the topic of trail conditions. Most brushed off my concerns, but a few shared stories similar to ours. Unexpected hazards, trails that didn't match their maps, and an overall sense that something wasn't quite right. It was while I was eavesdropping on a conversation between two ski instructors that I got my first real clue. They were arguing in hushed tones near the equipment rental shop, unaware of my presence around the corner. "We can't keep this up," one of them hissed. "People are going to get hurt." "People already have gotten hurt," the other replied, his voice grim. "But what choice do we have? You know what they'll do if we don't play along." Before I could hear more, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to find myself face to face with the ski patrol member I'd seen watching us on the slope. "Enjoying your stay, sir?" he asked, his tone friendly but his eyes hard as ice. I mumbled something non-committal and hurried away, my heart pounding. Back in our room, I paced back and forth, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. What were they hiding? Who were they? And most importantly, how much danger were we in? I was still mulling it over when Karen and the kids returned, flushed and happy from their swim. Seeing their carefree faces, I made a decision. We had to leave. Now. "Pack your bags," I told them, trying to keep my voice calm. "We're cutting the vacation short." Karen started to protest, but something in my expression must have convinced her. Within an hour, we were packed and heading for the front desk to check out. The night manager was there again, his ever-present smile taking on a predatory edge as we approached. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Family emergency," I lied, sliding our key cards across the desk. He made a show of tapping at his computer, the seconds stretching into an eternity. Finally, he looked up, his smile now a full-blown smirk. "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but it seems there's been an issue with your payment. We'll need to sort that out before you can leave." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of issue?" "Oh, just a small discrepancy," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Why don't you come into the back office and we can straighten it all out?" I was about to refuse when I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. The ski patrol member from earlier was now standing by the main entrance, his stance casual, but his eyes locked on us. Another staff member had appeared near the elevators, effectively blocking our escape routes. Karen must have sensed the tension. She squeezed my hand, her eyes questioning. I gave a small nod, hoping she'd understand. "You know what?" I said, forcing a laugh. "It's late. Why don't we deal with this in the morning? We'll just head back up to our room for now." The night manager's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Of course, sir. We'll see you bright and early." As soon as we were back in our room, I filled Karen in on everything. To her credit, she listened without interrupting, her face growing paler by the minute. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, pulling the kids close. "I know," I replied. "But they're watching the exit. We need a plan." We spent the next hour in hushed conversation, formulating our escape. The kids, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained uncharacteristically quiet. At 3 a.m., when the lodge was at its quietest, we made our move. We slipped out of our room, bags in hand, and made our way to the service elevator I'd noticed earlier. It was a tense ride down to the garage level, every small sound making us jump. The garage was dimly lit and eerily silent. We crept between the rows of cars, searching for one that might be unlocked. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I spotted an old maintenance truck with the keys still in the ignition. "It's stealing," Karen whispered, but there was no real protest in her voice. "It's surviving," I countered, ushering the family into the cab. The truck's engine roared to life, echoing off the concrete walls. I threw it into gear and gunned it towards the exit, praying the gate would be open. It wasn't, but at that moment, faced with the choice between crashing through a wooden gate and staying in that nightmarish lodge, the decision was easy. We burst out onto the snow-covered road, the shouts of pursuit fading behind us. As we wound our way down the mountain, the first light of dawn began to paint the sky. Nobody spoke until we hit the main highway, the lodge now far behind us. It was Tommy who finally broke the silence. "Dad," he said, his voice small. "What just happened?" I met Karen's eyes in the rearview mirror, saw the same mix of relief and lingering fear that I felt. "I don't know, buddy," I replied honestly. "But we're safe now. That's what matters." We never did find out the full truth about Silver Pine Lodge. The police investigation that followed turned up some irregularities in the resort's finances and safety records, but nothing that explained the horrors we'd experienced. The place closed down shortly after, its secrets buried beneath the pristine aspen snow. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, I still dream of that mountain, of hidden dangers lurking beneath perfect powder, and smiling faces that hide deadly intentions. And I wonder about the other families who've checked in after us, oblivious to the nightmare that awaited them in that winter wonderland gone wrong. Story 5. The abandoned hospital loomed before me, a decaying giant against the twilight sky. I never thought my quest for the perfect photograph would lead me into the mouth of madness. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized too late that some places are abandoned for a reason. My name's Sarah, and urban exploration has been my passion for years. There's something magical about capturing the beauty and decay, finding the stories hidden in the dust and shadows of forgotten places. When I heard about St. Mary's Hospital, a massive complex shut down decades ago, due to mysterious circumstances, I knew I had to see it for myself. I arrived just before sunset, my camera bag heavy on my shoulder as I slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence. The fading light cast long shadows across the overgrown parking lot, and a cool breeze carried the musty scent of neglect. Perfect conditions for the moody shots I had in mind. The main entrance was boarded up, but I found a side door with a broken lock. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom to reveal peeling wallpaper and abandoned wheelchairs scattered in the hallway. I started snapping photos immediately, losing myself in the process. The play of light and shadow, the textures of decay. It was a photographer's dream. I moved deeper into the building, each room offering new compositions, new stories to capture. It wasn't until I reached the 3rd floor that I noticed something odd. In one of the patient rooms, there was a chair pulled up to the window, as if someone had been sitting there recently. The thick layer of dust covering everything else was conspicuously absent from the chair's seat. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. Probably just other urban explorers, I told myself. I wasn't the only one who knew about this place, after all. I continued my exploration, eventually finding my way to the old surgical wing. The operating theaters were a goldmine of creepy imagery, rusted equipment, shattered observation windows, and ominous stains on the floors and walls. I was so engrossed in my photography that I almost missed the sound. A whisper, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. Words I couldn't quite make out, echoing from somewhere down the darkened hallway. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" Silence. And then, unmistakably, footsteps, coming closer. My heart began to race. I fumbled with my flashlight, scanning the hallway, but the beam revealed nothing but empty space and dancing dust motes. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, flitting across the far end of the corridor. It was there and gone in an instant, but it was undeniably human-shaped. Fear gripped me, and I did what any sane person would do. I ran. I sprinted back the way I'd come, my camera bag thumping against my side as I navigated the maze-like hallways. But in my panic, I must have taken a wrong turn. Instead of finding the stairwell, I found myself in a part of the hospital I hadn't seen before. The whispers started again, louder now, coming from all around me. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was urgent, insistent. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I spun around, trying to locate the source. That's when I saw the writing on the walls. Scrawled in what looked disturbingly like dried blood were messages I couldn't comprehend, strings of numbers, bizarre symbols, and fragments of sentences that made no sense. "The veil is thin," one read. "They're coming through," said another. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't right. This wasn't just decay and neglect. Something was very, very wrong here. I turned to run again and collided hard with something solid. I screamed, stumbling backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. In the dim light, I saw a figure looming over me. For a split second, I thought it was a person. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized with dawning horror that it was too tall, too thin to be human. Its limbs were impossibly long, and where its face should have been was just darkness. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning my fallen flashlight, and ran blindly into the darkness. I could hear it behind me, a sound like dry leaves scraping against the floor. The whispers grew to a crescendo, filling my head until I could barely think. I don't know how long I ran, or how many turns I took. All I knew was that I had to get out, had to escape whatever nightmarish thing was pursuing me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Finally, mercifully, I saw a sliver of moonlight ahead, a window. Without hesitation, I threw myself towards it, using my camera bag as a makeshift battering ram. The old, brittle glass shattered, and I found myself falling. I hit the overgrown shrubbery below hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I lay there, gasping for air, waiting for those impossibly long arms to reach down and grab me, but nothing came. The night was silent, save for the pounding of my heart and the distant hoot of an owl. Slowly, painfully, I picked myself up. My clothes were torn, and I was covered in cuts and bruises, but I was alive. I looked up at the window I'd jumped from. It was only the second floor, thankfully. But what I saw in that broken window made my blood run cold. Faces, dozens of pale, gaunt faces, pressed against the glass, staring down at me with hollow eyes. And behind them, towering over all, was that impossibly tall, dark figure. I ran until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I glanced back at the looming bulk of the hospital. As I peeled out of the overgrown parking lot, I could have sworn I saw movement in every window, as if the entire building was alive with writhing shadows. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I developed the photos I had taken, hoping they would prove that what I'd experienced was just a product of an overactive imagination and low blood sugar. But the photos, they showed things I hadn't seen. In the background of shots I'd taken of empty rooms, there were figures, blurry, indistinct, but undeniably there. Faces peering around corners, long-limbed shadows stretching across walls. And in one photo of an empty hallway, clear as day, was a tall, thin figure with no face, standing at the far end. I destroyed the photos, deleted every digital copy, but it didn't matter. The images were burned into my memory, as vivid as the moment I'd lived them. For weeks, I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me from that hospital. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of something tall and thin, only for it to vanish when I turned to look. The whispers came in my dreams, growing clearer each night. They spoke of things beyond my comprehension, of veils between worlds wearing thin, of entities waiting to cross over. They told me I'd been marked, that what I'd encountered in the hospital was just the beginning. I tried to go back, once, to face my fears, to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. But as I approached the hospital, I saw that the entire building was swarming with something. Shadows that moved against the light, figures that twisted in impossible ways. I turned around and drove away, and I've never gone back. It's been months now, and I haven't picked up my camera since that night. The urge to explore abandoned places, once so strong, has been replaced by a deep-seated fear of what might be lurking in those forgotten corners. But the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, staring at the shadows in the corners of my room, it's the certainty that what I encountered in that hospital is still out there, still waiting, and the nagging fear that maybe, just maybe, a part of it came back with me. Sometimes, when the night is at its darkest and the world is silent, I hear those whispers again, and I know, with a bone-deep certainty, that the tall, thin figure with no face is out there somewhere, waiting, watching, and one day it will come for me. So let my story be a warning. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and sometimes the perfect shot isn't worth the price you might have to pay. Because in the decaying halls of forgotten places, in the shadows of abandoned dreams, there are things waiting. Things that should never see the light of day. And once you've seen them, truly seen them, you can never unsee them again. The veil is thin, and they're coming through. And God help us all when they do. Story 6. I never thought a simple act of kindness could lead to the most terrifying night of my life. But as I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes darting between the empty highway ahead and the increasingly unstable stranger beside me, I realized that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're sitting right next to you, wearing a friendly smile. My name's Mike, and I've been driving big rigs across the country for the better part of 2 decades. There's a certain peace to be found in the long, lonely stretches of highway. Just you and the rumble of the engine and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before you. But that night, that godforsaken night, the solitude of the open road became a trap I wasn't sure I'd escape. It was a run like any other, hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Los Angeles. I'd been on the road for about 10 hours, the sun long since set, when I pulled into a truck stop in western Nebraska for some coffee and a quick break. That's where I first saw him. A lanky guy in his 30s, shaggy hair poking out from under a worn baseball cap. Thumb out as he tried to hitch a ride from the few cars fueling up. I didn't think much of it at first. Hitchhikers aren't uncommon out here in the middle of nowhere. But as I was walking back to my rig, steaming coffee in hand, I noticed the guy was still there, looking more dejected by the minute as car after car passed him by. Maybe it was the loneliness of the road getting to me. Maybe it was just plain old human decency. Whatever it was, I found myself walking over to him. "Where are you headed?" I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. His face lit up, relief evident in his eyes. "West," he said. "Anywhere west. Just trying to get to my sister's place in Nevada." I hesitated for a moment. Company policy strictly forbade picking up hitchhikers, but the guy looked harmless enough, and I'd been driving solo for so long that the idea of some conversation was admittedly appealing. "Hop in," I said, nodding towards my truck. "I can get you as far as Salt Lake City." The smile that spread across his face was one of pure gratitude. "Man, you're a lifesaver," he said, extending his hand. "Name's Jack." I shook it, introduced myself, and we climbed into the cab of my truck. As we pulled back onto the highway, the vast darkness of the Great Plains stretching out around us, I felt pretty good about my decision. Jack seemed like a decent guy, and his cheerful chatter was a welcome break from the monotony of the road. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. We talked about our families, our jobs. He was between gigs, he said, our favorite roads to travel. But as we crossed into Colorado, I began to notice subtle changes in Jack's behavior. It started with his leg bouncing up and down incessantly. Then his speech began to speed up, his thoughts jumping erratically from one topic to another. He'd go from laughing uproariously at something I'd said to staring out the window in complete silence, his body unnaturally still. "You okay there, Jack?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, even as unease began to creep up my spine. He turned to look at me, and I had to suppress a shudder. His pupils were dilated, swallowing up almost all of the iris. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool air pumping from the AC. "I'm great, Mike. Just great," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "Hey, you ever think about how weird it is that we're all just hurtling through space on this big rock? Like, what if we just flew off into the void?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind racing. It was clear now that Jack was on something, probably coming down hard from whatever high he'd been riding. And I was stuck in a small cab with him, miles from anywhere. "Maybe we should pull over," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get some air, stretch our legs." Jack's hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "No," he almost shouted. "No, we can't stop. They'll find us if we stop." A chill ran down my spine. "Who'll find us? Jack?" His eyes darted around wildly, as if expecting to see someone materialize in the cab with us. "Them, the shadow people. They've been following me for days, but they can't catch us if we keep moving." My heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I'd dealt with my fair share of difficult situations on the road, but nothing like this. I was trapped in a metal box, hurtling down the highway at 70 miles an hour with a man who was clearly in the grips of some kind of drug-induced psychosis. I tried to think through my options. I couldn't just kick him out. We were in the middle of nowhere, and despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to abandon him like that. But continuing on like this wasn't an option either. Sooner or later, his paranoia might turn on me. "Jack," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. "There's no one following us. You're safe here. But I think maybe you're not feeling too well. Why don't we find a place to stop? Get you some water?" I never got to finish that sentence. In a move so fast I barely saw it. Jack reached over and grabbed the steering wheel, jerking it hard to the right. The truck swerved violently. I fought for control, my heart in my throat, as I felt the massive vehicle tilt dangerously. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to roll. But somehow, I managed to wrestle us back onto the road, tires screeching in protest. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, fear and anger making my voice shake. Jack was pressed against the passenger door, his eyes wild with terror. "They're here," he screamed. "They're right behind us. We have to lose them." I realized then just how dangerous the situation had become. This wasn't just about my safety anymore. If Jack tried something like that again, we could easily cause a massive accident, endangering not just ourselves, but anyone else on the road. I needed to end this, and fast. But how? We were still miles from the nearest town, and I had no way to call for help. My CB radio was there, but I couldn't risk taking my hands off the wheel or my eyes off the road to use it. Not with Jack in this state. That's when I remembered there was a rest stop coming up in about 10 miles. If I could just make it there, maybe I could find help, or at least put some distance between us. "Hey Jack," I said, forcing a note of excitement into my voice. "I think I know a way to lose them for good. There's a secret path coming up, but we've got to be ready to move fast. You with me?" For a moment, Jack just stared at me, his chest heaving with rapid breaths. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, let's do it." The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. I kept up a steady stream of reassuring bullshit, telling Jack about this imaginary escape route, while keeping a white-knuckled grip on the wheel and praying he wouldn't see through my lie. Finally, blessedly, I saw the signs for the rest stop. "This is it," I said, putting every ounce of conviction I could muster into my voice. "You ready?" Jack nodded, his entire body coiled like a spring about to release. I took the exit, slowing down just enough to make the turn safely. As soon as we pulled into the rest stop, I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in front of the small cluster of buildings. "Run!" I shouted at Jack. "I'll hold them off." "Go." He didn't need to be told twice. In a flash, he was out of the cab and sprinting towards the trees at the edge of the parking lot. I watched him go, my heart still racing, hardly daring to believe my plan had worked. As soon as Jack disappeared into the darkness, I locked the doors and grabbed my CB radio. Within minutes, I was talking to the state police, giving them a description of Jack and explaining the situation. They arrived about 20 minutes later, lights flashing but sirens off. They found Jack huddled in the woods, coming down hard and barely coherent. As they led him to a patrol car, one of the officers came over to take my statement. "You did the right thing," he told me after I'd finished recounting the night's events. "This could have ended a lot worse." I nodded, suddenly feeling every one of my 50-plus years. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me shaky and exhausted. As I watched the patrol cars pull away, Jack secured in the back of one of them, I couldn't help but think about how quickly things had spiraled out of control. One moment of kindness had turned into hours of terror, all because I'd picked up a stranger on the side of the road. I climbed back into my truck, the cab feeling enormous and empty now. As I pulled back onto the highway, the pre-dawn light just starting to paint the eastern sky, I made a promise to myself. No more hitchhikers. No more risking my life for a bit of company. Because out here on the open road, in the vast emptiness between cities, you never really know who or what you're letting into your life. And sometimes, the real danger isn't in the lonely miles of highway or the dark nights in unfamiliar places. Sometimes, the real danger is sitting right beside you, wearing a friendly smile and hiding monsters behind their eyes. Story 7. The forest was supposed to be our escape, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. Instead, it became our prison, a green hell where every tree could hide a threat and every shadow held the promise of death. I never thought I'd fear the sound of birdsong, but now it's all I can do not to scream when I hear it. My name's Alex, and I've always been the outdoorsy type. So when my friends, Jake, Sarah, and Mia suggested a weekend camping trip to celebrate the end of our grueling final year of college, I jumped at the chance. We chose a remote area known for its pristine hiking trails and stunning vistas, far from the crowds and noise of more popular camping spots. The drive out was full of laughter and excitement, the stress of exams and job hunting melting away as the urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and eventually thick forests. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, shouldered our packs, and set off into the woods. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. We hiked until the sun started to dip below the tree line, then found a perfect clearing to set up camp. As we sat around the campfire that night, roasting marshmallows and trading stories, I remember thinking how lucky we were to have this moment, this connection with each other and the world around us. If only I'd known it would be our last moment of peace. The trouble started on the second day. We'd planned a long hike to a supposedly breathtaking waterfall about 6 miles from our campsite. The trail was more overgrown than we'd expected, but we pressed on, our spirits high. It was Jake who noticed it first. "Hey guys," he called out, pointing to a tree just off the trail. "Check this out." We gathered around, and I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm summer air. Carved into the bark was a symbol, a crude stick figure surrounded by a circle. It might have been innocuous on its own, but something about it felt wrong. "Probably just some other hikers messing around," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. We pressed on, trying to shake off the unease. But as we hiked, we began to notice more symbols carved into trees. Some were the same stick figure. Others were more complex. Spirals, jagged lines, and shapes I couldn't begin to describe. They became more frequent the further we went, until it felt like every tree bore some kind of marking. "This isn't right," Mia said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Maybe we should head back." Part of me wanted to agree, but another part, the part that had always pushed me to explore, to see what was just over the next hill, urged us to continue. "Let's just go a little further," I suggested. "The waterfall can't be far now. That decision will haunt me for the rest of my life." We hiked for another hour, the symbols growing more elaborate and unsettling with each step. The forest around us seemed to change, too. The birdsong that had filled the air that morning faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under our feet. Then we found the clearing. It was a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, completely devoid of undergrowth. At its center stood a crude altar made of stacked stones. And hanging from the branches of the surrounding trees were things. Bundles wrapped in leaves and vines, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her face pale. Now, no one argued this time. We turned to retrace our steps, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. But in our haste and growing panic, we must have taken a wrong turn. Nothing looked familiar. The symbols on the trees seemed to mock us, changing and shifting when we weren't looking directly at them. Night fell with terrifying swiftness, the forest plunging into a darkness so complete it felt almost solid. We huddled together, using the flashlight on Jake's phone to set up a hasty camp. None of us wanted to stop, but stumbling around in the dark seemed even more dangerous. "It'll be okay," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll find our way back in the morning." But morning brought no relief. We woke to find strange symbols drawn in the dirt around our tents, mirroring the ones we'd seen carved into the trees. And worse, our backpacks, containing most of our food, water, and supplies, were gone. "This isn't happening," Mia said, her voice shaking. "This can't be happening." But it was. And it was about to get much, much worse. We picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find a trail, a road, anything that might lead us back to civilization. But the forest seemed to change around us, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks shifting when we looked away. It was as if the entire woods were alive, toying with us. By midday, we were exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. That's when we heard it. A sound that turned my blood to ice. Drumming. A slow, steady beat that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Run," I said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "Run now." We ran. Through underbrush that tore at our clothes and skin, over fallen logs and treacherous roots. The drumming grew louder, joined now by chanting in a language I'd never heard before and never want to hear again. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish forest. But eventually, we burst out of the tree line and found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine. The chanting was all around us now, and through the trees, I could see flickers of torchlight. "We have to jump," Jake said, peering over the edge. At the bottom, maybe 30 feet down, a river rushed by. Sarah shook her head frantically. "We'll die. We'll die if we stay here," I countered, already backing up to get a running start. The decision was made for us when the first figure emerged from the trees. It was humanoid, but wrong in ways I still struggled to describe. Too tall, too thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. Behind it came others, all wearing masks made of bark and leaves. We jumped. The impact with the water drove the air from my lungs. The current grabbed me immediately, tumbling me over and over until I didn't know which way was up. Somehow, I managed to break the surface, gasping for air. "Jake!" I shouted. "Sarah, Mia." There was no answer. The river carried me swiftly downstream, away from our pursuers, but also away from my friends. I managed to grab onto a low-hanging branch and pull myself to shore, collapsing on the rocky bank. For hours, I stumbled along the riverside, calling for my friends until my voice was hoarse. But there was no sign of them. As night fell again, I was forced to seek shelter, finding a small cave in the rock face. That's where I am now, huddled in the dark, jumping at every sound. I managed to start a small fire, but its light feels feeble against the pressing darkness outside. I don't know if my friends are alive. I don't know if I'll ever find my way out of these woods. And I don't know if the things that chased us are still out there, searching. All I know is that the forest is alive in ways I never imagined, and it's hungry. The symbols, the clearing, the masked figures, they're all part of something ancient and malevolent. Something that's been waiting in these woods for who knows how long. If you're reading this, please send help. But be careful. The trails are treacherous, The landmarks shift, and the trees are watching. And whatever you do, if you see symbols carved into bark, turn back. Turn back before it's too late. Because in these woods, the real monsters aren't the bears, or the wolves, or even the masked figures that hunted us. The real monster is the forest itself. And once it has you in its grasp, it never lets go. I can hear drumming again, distant, but growing closer. The fire is dying, and with it, my hope. If anyone finds this, tell our families we love them. And whatever you do, stay out of the woods. Some places are not meant for humans to tread, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The drumming is louder now, I think. I think they found me. God help me, I think they found me. Story 8. I never thought I'd die in a house I was trying to sell. But as the sun set on what should have been a routine showing, I realized that this beautiful, empty home might become our tomb. And the worst part, the danger wasn't coming from outside. It was already in here with us. My name's Rachel, and I've been a real estate agent for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of weird houses and eccentric clients, but nothing could have prepared me for that day. It started like any other. I had a showing scheduled for a gorgeous Victorian mansion that had been on the market for months. The price was a steal for what you were getting, but something about the place had kept buyers away. I was determined to change that. The clients were a young couple, Tom and Emily, looking for their forever home. They arrived right on time, wide-eyed as they took in the house's imposing facade. "It's beautiful," Emily breathed, and I felt that familiar surge of excitement. This could be the sale I'd been waiting for. I led them through the grand entrance, launching into my well-rehearsed spiel about the home's history and unique features. The interior was even more impressive than the outside. Soaring ceilings, intricate woodwork, and enough space to get lost in. Tom and Emily were clearly smitten, asking all the right questions as we moved from room to room. Everything was going perfectly until we reached the 3rd floor. I was showing them a quaint little study when we heard it. A loud, mechanical click that echoed through the empty house. Emily jumped, grabbing Tom's arm. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. I forced a reassuring smile. Probably just the house settling. These old places make all sorts of noises. But as I turned to lead them back downstairs, I realized something was very, very wrong. The door we'd come through just minutes ago was now firmly shut, and when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. "That's odd," I muttered, jiggling the handle with increasing desperation. This door shouldn't lock automatically. Tom stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Here, let me try." But even his strength couldn't budge it. We were locked in. "Okay, don't panic," I said, as much to myself as to them. "I'm sure it's just stuck. Let's try the windows." But the windows were no help either. They were the old, heavy kind that didn't open more than a few inches. Not nearly enough for any of us to squeeze through. And we were 3 stories up, so even if we could open them fully, it wasn't exactly a safe exit strategy. I pulled out my cell phone, ready to call for help, only to find I had no signal. Tom and Emily checked theirs as well, with the same result. It was as if the house itself was blocking our connection to the outside world. "This can't be happening," Emily said, her voice rising with panic. "There has to be a way out." We spent the next hour searching every inch of that 3rd floor, looking for another exit, a hidden staircase, anything. But all we found were more locked doors and windows that wouldn't open. It was like the house had transformed into a giant trap, with us as the prey. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, a new fear set in. What if we were stuck here all night? What if no one came looking for us? I tried to keep Tom and Emily calm, but I could see the fear growing in their eyes with each passing minute. That's when things went from bad to terrifying. We were huddled in the study, trying to come up with a plan, when the lights flickered and died. The sudden darkness was absolute, pressing in on us from all sides. Emily let out a small scream, quickly muffled. "It's okay," I said, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. "It's probably just a fuse." Old houses like this, I never finished that sentence. Because as the weak light from my phone illuminated the room, we all saw it. The door, the same door that had been stubbornly locked for hours, was now standing wide open. For a moment, none of us moved. The open door seemed to mock us, a dark rectangle leading out into the equally dark hallway beyond. "We should go," Tom said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is our chance." Part of me wanted to agree, but another part, the part that had been growing increasingly uneasy since we'd first found ourselves trapped, screamed that this was wrong. That door hadn't opened by itself. Before I could voice my concerns, Emily was already moving, pulled by the promise of escape. She stepped into the hallway, Tom close behind her. I had no choice but to follow. The hallway seemed different in the dark, longer and more twisted than I remembered. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the space around us was much larger than it should have been. I tried to orient myself, to remember which way led to the stairs, but nothing looked familiar. We turned a corner, and I froze. At the end of the corridor was a figure, silhouetted against a window. It was unnaturally tall and thin, its proportions all wrong for a human. Emily saw it too. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure turned, slowly, mechanically, to face us. Where its eyes should have been were only dark, empty sockets. We ran. Blind panic propelled us through the darkness, taking turns at random, no longer caring about finding the stairs, just desperate to get away from that thing. Doors slammed behind us, the sound chasing us down the twisting corridors. The house seemed to be changing around us, hallways stretching and contracting, rooms appearing where none had been before. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmare maze. But eventually, we found ourselves in a large, circular room that I was certain hadn't been there during the initial tour. Moonlight filtered through a domed skylight, illuminating what looked like an old elevator in the center of the room. "We can use that to get down," Tom exclaimed, already moving towards it. But something held me back. This was all wrong. The house didn't have an elevator. And even if it did, why would it be working when nothing else was? "Wait," I called out, but it was too late. Tom had already pulled open the elevator gate and stepped inside, Emily close behind him. "Come on," Emily shouted, holding the gate open for me. "We have to go." I hesitated for a split second, torn between my instincts and the desperate need to escape. That moment of indecision saved my life. As I took a step towards the elevator, the lights inside it flickered to life, and in that brief illumination, I saw the truth. The elevator car wasn't there. It was just an empty shaft, a black pit leading down to God knows where. "No!" I screamed, lunging forward. But I was too late. The gate slammed shut, and Tom and Emily plummeted into the darkness, their screams echoing up the shaft until they were suddenly, horribly, cut off. I collapsed to the floor, my mind reeling from what I'd just witnessed. This couldn't be real. Houses didn't do this. This had to be a nightmare. But the cold floor beneath me and the lingering echo of those screams told me this was all too real. I was alone now, trapped in a house that seemed intent on destroying anyone within its walls. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear and grief. But eventually, a new sound penetrated my daze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I scrambled to my feet, looking wildly around for somewhere to hide. But the room was empty save for the elevator shaft, a gaping maw in the center of the floor. The footsteps grew louder, and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it was the figure we'd seen earlier, the not-quite-human thing that had chased us through the twisting hallways. As the door to the room began to open, I made a choice born of pure desperation. I climbed onto the edge of the elevator shaft, my feet dangling over the abyss. Maybe, just maybe, there was a ledge or something I could grab onto. The figure entered the room, its eyeless gaze fixed on me. It began to move forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. I knew I was out of time. I jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. Wind rushed past me as I plummeted into darkness, waiting for the impact that would end it all. But it never came. Instead, I found myself suddenly, impossibly, standing on solid ground. I blinked, disoriented. I was back in the foyer of the house, sunlight streaming through the windows. Tom and Emily stood beside me, looking as confused as I felt. "What? What just happened?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. Before I could answer, the front door swung open. A man in a crisp suit stood there, a briefcase in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. "Ah, you must be the potential buyers," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm the owner. I hope you've enjoyed your tour of the house. It has a way of testing those who enter, but I can see you've passed. Are you ready to make an offer?" I looked at Tom and Emily, saw the same mix of confusion, fear, and dawning realization on their faces that I'm sure was mirrored on my own. Whatever had just happened, whatever we'd just experienced, it wasn't over. The house had chosen us, and I had a feeling that refusing its offer wasn't an option. As the owner's smile grew wider, more predatory, I realized that our nightmare was just beginning. And in that moment, I knew with terrifying certainty that we would never leave this house. Not really. Not ever. Story 9. The hospital was supposed to be a place of healing, but as I watched another patient vanish into thin air, I realized it had become a gateway to something far more sinister. In the sterile halls of St. Mary's, I uncovered a truth that would haunt me for the rest of my life. If I managed to survive the night shift, my name is Sarah, and I've been a night shift nurse at St. Mary's General Hospital for the past 5 years. I've always preferred the quiet of the night, the way the hospital seems to breathe with a life of its own when most of the world is asleep. But lately, that quiet has taken on a menacing edge. It started about a month ago. I was doing my regular rounds, checking on the patients in the East Wing, when I noticed something odd. Mr. Johnson, an elderly man recovering from hip surgery, wasn't in his bed. Now, patients wandering off isn't uncommon, especially with the older folks who get confused easily. But Mr. Johnson was bedridden. He couldn't have gotten up on his own. I searched the entire floor, growing more frantic by the minute. Just as I was about to call security, I heard a noise from his room. I rushed back, and there he was, sound asleep in his bed, as if he'd never left. I tried to convince myself I was just overtired, that I'd somehow overlooked him in my initial check. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Mr. Johnson had vanished and then reappeared with no explanation. Over the next few weeks, it happened again and again. Patients would disappear from their rooms, only to reappear hours later with no memory of where they'd been. Each time, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality a little more. I started keeping a log, noting down every disappearance, every inexplicable reappearance. Patterns began to emerge. It was always during the night shift, always patients who were alone in their rooms, and always in the East Wing. I tried talking to my colleagues, but they either didn't believe me or brushed it off as patients sleepwalking or my imagination running wild. But I knew what I was seeing, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. Last night, everything came to a head. I was doing my usual rounds when I heard a strange humming coming from room 237. The patient there, a young woman named Emily, recovering from appendix surgery, had been one of the disappearers just 2 nights before. I approached the room cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The humming grew louder, and as I reached for the door handle, I could have sworn I saw a faint blue light seeping out from under the door. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. What I saw inside will stay with me for the rest of my life. Emily was floating about 3 feet above her bed, surrounded by a pulsing blue light. Her eyes were open but blank, staring at nothing, and around her, moving in and out of the light, were shapes. Dark, formless things that seemed to shift and change every time I tried to focus on them. I must have made a sound, because suddenly everything stopped. The humming cut off abruptly, the light vanished, and Emily dropped back onto her bed with a soft thud. The shapes, I don't know where they went. It was like they were never there. I ran from the room, my mind reeling. This was so far beyond anything I'd imagined. It wasn't just patients disappearing. It was something otherworldly. I don't know how I made it through the rest of my shift. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. When morning finally came, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to tell someone, had to make them believe me. I waited in the staff room for Dr. Reeves, the chief of medicine. He'd always been kind to me, and I hoped he would at least hear me out. When he arrived, I spilled everything. The disappearances, the reappearances, and what I'd seen in Emily's room. I expected disbelief, maybe even concern for my mental health. What I didn't expect was the look of resignation that crossed his face. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy, "I think it's time you knew the truth." Over the next hour, Dr. Reeves revealed a story so incredible, so terrifying, that part of me wished I could unhear it. Said, Mary's, it turned out, wasn't just a hospital. It was built on a site of great power, a place where the veil between our world and something else was thin. For years, the hospital had been conducting secret experiments, trying to harness this power for medical breakthroughs. They believed they could use it to cure diseases, to save lives in ways modern medicine never could. But something had gone wrong. The experiments had weakened the barrier between worlds, and now things were coming through. The disappearing patients weren't just vanishing. They were being taken, studied by entities from the other side. "We've been trying to stop it, Doctor," Reeves said, his eyes pleading for understanding. "To seal the breach. But it's not that simple. And if word got out, the panic would be unimaginable." I sat there, stunned into silence. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from St. Mary's as possible. But another part, the part that had become a nurse to help people, knew I couldn't just walk away. "What can we do?" I asked, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "Doctor," Reeves looked relieved, like he'd been afraid I'd run screaming from the room. "We have a plan," he said, "but it's dangerous. And we need someone who can move around the hospital at night without raising suspicion." And that's how I found myself, 12 hours later, preparing for the most terrifying night shift of my life. The plan was simple in theory. Plant devices at key points around the East Wing that would theoretically strengthen the barrier between worlds. In practice, it meant navigating dark corridors, knowing that at any moment, I might come face to face with something from beyond our reality. I started on the ground floor, my hands shaking as I placed the first device. A small, innocuous-looking box that hummed faintly behind a vending machine. As I straightened up, I could have sworn I saw something move in the reflection of the machine's glass front. But when I spun around, the corridor was empty. Floor by floor, I made my way up the East Wing. With each device I planted, the air seemed to grow thicker, harder to breathe. The shadows in the corners of my vision writhed and twisted, always disappearing when I tried to look directly at them. On the 4th floor, outside room 237, I hesitated. This was where I'd seen, whatever it was I'd seen, the night before. As I reached into my pocket for the device, I heard that now familiar humming start up behind the closed door. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew I had to place the device here, most of all. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the box and knelt to secure it behind a nearby radiator. The humming grew louder, and I saw that telltale blue light starting to seep out from under the door. I worked faster, my breath coming in short gasps. Just as I clicked the device into place, the door to room 237 burst open. The blue light flooded the corridor, so bright it was almost blinding. And in the doorway stood something. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Too tall, too thin, with too many joints bending in impossible directions. I scrambled backwards, a scream caught in my throat. The thing took a step towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. But then the device behind the radiator let out a high-pitched whine, and the creature recoiled as if in pain. The blue light flickered and died, and the thing in the doorway seemed to fold in on itself, collapsing into nothing more than a shadow that quickly dissipated. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I ran, planting the remaining devices in a blur of terror and adrenaline. By the time I placed the last one on the top floor of the East Wing, I was drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. As I placed the final device, a wave of something rippled through the air. For a moment, the world seemed to shimmer like heat haze on a summer day. And then everything snapped back into focus, and the oppressive atmosphere that had been building all night suddenly lifted. I made my way back down to the ground floor on shaky legs, hardly daring to believe it was over. Dr. Reeves was waiting for me in the lobby, his face drawn and tired, but his eyes shining with hope. "It worked," he said simply. "The readings. The barrier is stabilizing. You did it, Sarah." I should have felt relieved, triumphant even. But all I felt was a bone-deep weariness and annoying uncertainty. Yes, we'd closed the breach, at least for now. But the knowledge of what lay beyond, of how thin the veil between our world and the unknown truly was, that would stay with me forever. As I left the hospital that morning, the sun rising on what seemed like an ordinary day, I knew my life would never be the same. I'd seen behind the curtain, glimpsed the terrifying truth of what really lurks in the shadows. I still work the night shift at St. Mary's. Someone has to keep watch to make sure the barrier holds. But now, every time I walk those quiet halls, I can't help but wonder, what else don't we know about the world around us? And how long before we're forced to find out? Story 10. The moment I pressed play on that old VHS tape, I knew our dream home had become a nightmare. The grainy footage showed our own move-in day, filmed from inside the walls we'd lovingly restored. We thought we were alone in this house, but something had been watching us all along. My name's Kate, and my husband Tom and I had always dreamed of owning a piece of history. When we stumbled across the listing for the old Willow Grove farmhouse, it seemed too good to be true. A Victorian-era beauty, a bit run down but with good bones, as they say. We saw potential where others saw a money pit. The first few months were a whirlwind of renovation. We threw ourselves into the work, stripping away layers of old wallpaper, refinishing hardwood floors hidden under musty carpets, and updating the ancient plumbing and electrical systems. Every discovery felt like unwrapping a gift. Original crown molding here, a hidden fireplace there. We were bringing the old girl back to life, and it felt amazing. It was during one of these renovation sessions that we made the discovery that would change everything. Tom was tearing out a section of drywall in what we planned to make our home office when he found it. A small door, about 2 feet square, hidden behind the plaster.
Kate,
He called out, excitement evident in his voice.
come look at this.
I hurried up the stairs, curious to see what he'd found. The door was old, its wood dark with age, and it blended so perfectly with the surrounding paneling that it was no wonder it had been overlooked for so long. "What do you think it is?" I asked, running my hand over the smooth wood. Tom shrugged, a boyish grin on his face. Only one way to find out. He pulled on the small brass handle, and the door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. Inside was a space about the size of a large closet, filled with dust and cobwebs. And there, stacked neatly against one wall, was a pile of old VHS tapes. "Jackpot," Tom exclaimed, reaching in to grab one. Maybe the previous owners left their home movie collection. I laughed, but something about the hidden room made me uneasy. Why hide a bunch of old tapes behind a wall? We spent the rest of the day finishing up our work, but I could tell Tom was itching to check out our discovery. As soon as we'd cleaned up, he was setting up the old VCR we'd found in the attic when we first moved in. "Ready for movie night?" he asked, holding up one of the tapes. I nodded, curling up on the couch beside him, as he slid the tape into the player. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy image of our living room. "What's Tom muttered, leaning forward. The camera panned slowly across the room, which looked much as it had when we'd first viewed the house. Dusty, outdated, but with those beautiful original features that had made us fall in love with the place. "Is this from when the house was for sale?" I asked, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't right. The angle was all wrong, too low to the ground and inside the walls. Suddenly, the front door opened, and I felt my blood run cold. There we were, Tom and I, walking into the house for the first time as its new owners. I watched in growing horror as we explored the room, completely oblivious to the camera recording our every move. "Turn it off," I whispered, my voice shaking. But Tom seemed transfixed, his face pale in the blue light of the TV screen. We watched as the Tom and Kate on the screen left the living room, heading upstairs. The camera didn't follow. Instead, it swiveled, focusing on a section of wall. To my shock, a panel slid open silently and a hand reached out, adjusting the camera slightly. The tape ended abruptly, the screen dissolving into static. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The implications of what we'd just seen were too terrifying to put into words. "There has to be an explanation," Tom said finally, his voice hoarse. Maybe it's just an elaborate prank by the previous owners." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I knew this was no prank. Someone or something had been living in our walls, watching us from the moment we set foot in this house. Tom reached for another tape, his hand trembling slightly as he inserted it into the VCR. This one showed our bedroom, again, from an impossible angle inside the wall. We watched ourselves sleeping, unaware of the eyes upon us. Occasionally, the panel would slide open, and that hand would appear, adjusting the camera or reaching out as if to touch us before retreating. Tape after tape revealed the same horrifying truth. Every room in the house had hidden cameras. Every private moment, every conversation, every intimate encounter, all had been recorded by our unseen observer. "We have to call the police," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm, even to my own ears. Tom nodded, reaching for his phone. But before he could dial, a loud crash came from upstairs. We both froze, eyes locked on the ceiling above us. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice shaking. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, unmistakably, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. "They're looking for the tapes," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Tom stood, positioning himself between me and the stairs. "We need to get out of here now." We moved as quietly as we could towards the front door, the old floorboards creaking treacherously beneath our feet. The footsteps above had stopped, and the silence was somehow more terrifying than any noise could have been. Just as we reached the door, the lights went out, plunging us into darkness. I bit back a scream, groping blindly for Tom's hand. "It's okay," he whispered, giving my fingers a reassuring squeeze. "We're almost out." He reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. Locked. And not with the simple latch we used every day, but with a heavy-duty lock that hadn't been there this morning. "No, no, no," I muttered, panic rising in my throat. We were trapped. A floorboard creaked behind us, and we spun around. There, at the top of the stairs, was a figure. In the darkness, I could only make out a vague outline, but it was wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin to be human. "Who are you?" Tom demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to descend the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. As it got closer, I could see more details, and I wished I couldn't. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at impossible angles. And its face, where there should have been features, there was only smooth, blank skin. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me. Tom grabbed a lamp from a nearby table, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back!" he yelled, but the thing kept coming. In desperation, Tom hurled the lamp at the creature. It connected with a sickening thud, and the thing stumbled. For a moment, I dared to hope we might have a chance. But then it straightened up, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as it regarded us. And suddenly, its blank face split open, revealing a mouth full of needle-like teeth. What happened next is a blur in my memory. Somehow, we made it to the kitchen. Tom grabbed a knife, while I frantically searched for another way out. The creature followed, its movements jerky and inhuman. As it lunged for Tom, I saw my opening. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet and swung with all my might. There was a sickening crunch as it connected with the thing's head, and it crumpled to the floor. We didn't wait to see if it would get up. We ran, smashing through the back door and into the cool night air. We didn't stop running until we reached our neighbor's house, pounding on their door and babbling about monsters in the walls. The police came, of course. They searched the house, but found nothing. No hidden cameras, no secret rooms, no trace of the creature we'd fought. The tapes were gone too, as if they'd never existed. We were left with nothing but our wild story and the certainty that we could never feel safe in that house again. We moved out the next day, leaving behind our dream home and all the work we'd put into it. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear the sound of footsteps in the walls, or feel eyes watching me from hidden places. I don't know what that thing was, or why it chose our home. All I know is that the next time you're alone in your house, and you hear an unexplained creak, or see a shadow move in the corner of your eye, don't dismiss it, because sometimes the monsters hiding in the walls are all too real. Story 11. The forest had always been my sanctuary, but that night it became my prison. As I crouched in the underbrush, the sound of approaching footsteps sending my heart into overdrive. I realized that the true predators in these woods walked on two legs. My name's Maya, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwater National Forest for the past 7 years. I'd always loved the solitude of the deep woods, the way the trees seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. But now, as I huddled in the darkness, those whispers felt like warnings. It had started as a routine patrol. I was checking on some of the more remote campsites, making sure no one was breaking fire regulations or disturbing the wildlife. The sun was just starting to dip below the tree line when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. It was a snare, crudely made but effective, hidden just off one of the less traveled trails. My heart sank as I approached it. Poaching had been a growing problem in the park, but I'd never seen traps set this deep in the protected area before. I knelt to disarm the snare, my mind already racing with plans to increase patrols in this sector. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig, too loud and too close to be an animal. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to the radio at my belt. But before I could call for backup, I saw them. 3 men, dressed in camo gear, emerging from the trees like ghosts. The rifle in the lead man's hands told me all I needed to know. I'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a lone poacher. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence broken only by the call of a distant bird. Then the lead man smiled, a cold, predatory grin that sent chills down my spine. Well, he drawled. Looks like we've got ourselves a little problem here, boys. I took a step back, my mind racing. I was outnumbered and outgunned. My radio suddenly felt useless. Even if I could call for help, it would take hours for anyone to reach me out here. Listen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't want any trouble. Why don't we all just walk away from this? The man's grin widened. Oh, I don't think so, Ranger. You see, you've stumbled into something you shouldn't have. And we can't have you running off to tell tales, now can we? As he raised his rifle, instinct took over. I turned and ran, plunging into the thick underbrush. Behind me, I heard shouts, and then, terrifyingly, the crack of a gunshot. The bullet whizzed past my ear, so close I felt the displacement of air. I ran like I'd never run before, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. But I had one advantage. I knew these woods better than anyone. Every trail, every hidden glen, every treacherous ravine, It was my only hope of survival. As I crashed through a dense thicket, my mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. The ranger station was miles away, in the opposite direction. My truck was closer, but heading there would be predictable. No, I needed to lose them in the depths of the forest, and then circle back to civilization. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the underbrush with far less grace than their earlier stealth had suggested. They were calling to each other, coordinating their pursuit. I realized with a chill that this wasn't their first hunt, and I wasn't their intended prey. The forest grew darker as night fell, but I didn't dare slow down. I navigated by feel as much as sight, letting my instincts and years of experience guide me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but fear kept me moving. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I allowed myself a moment's pause, pressing my back against a massive oak and straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the rasp of my breathing. Then, distantly, a voice. Over here. I found tracks. They were still on my trail. I bit back a curse and pushed off from the tree, ready to run again. But as I turned, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, tumbling down a steep, brush-covered slope. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and winded. As I struggled to my feet, a jolt of pain shot through my ankle. Sprained, if I was lucky. Broken, if I wasn't. Either way, running was no longer an option. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I looked around frantically for some kind of shelter. That's when I saw it. A narrow opening at the base of a rocky outcropping, almost hidden by ferns and moss. A cave. I limped towards it as quickly and quietly as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The opening was tight, but I managed to squeeze through, finding myself in a small, damp chamber that smelled of earth and decaying leaves. I wedged myself as far back as I could, trying to slow my breathing and quiet the pounding of my heart. Outside, I could hear the men calling to each other, their voices growing closer. "She can't have gone far," one of them said, his voice unnervingly close to my hiding spot. "Not in this terrain." "Spread out," another voice commanded. "She's hurt. We'll find her." I closed my eyes, pressing myself against the cold stone of the cave wall. I'd never felt so alone, so vulnerable. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like an approach, and I had to fight the urge to bolt. Time seemed to stretch, minutes feeling like hours as I huddled in the darkness. My ankle throbbed, a constant reminder of the precariousness of my situation. Even if I managed to evade my pursuers through the night, how was I going to make it back to safety? As the night wore on, the sounds of the search grew more distant. But I didn't dare leave my hiding place. These men were hunters, patient and skilled. For all I knew, they were waiting for me to make just such a mistake. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding even my fear. I woke with a start, momentarily disoriented in the pitch blackness of the cave. Then it all came rushing back. The poachers, the chase, the hiding. I listened intently, but heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of the forest at night. Had they given up? Moved on to another area? Or were they still out there, waiting? I knew I couldn't stay in the cave forever. I needed to get back to the ranger station to report what I'd seen and get help. But the thought of stepping out into the open, exposed and vulnerable, made my stomach churn with fear. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and began to inch towards the cave entrance. The preon light was just starting to filter through the trees as I peeked out, scanning the area for any sign of my pursuers. Seeing nothing, I eased myself out of the cave, wincing as my injured ankle protested. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. I oriented myself, picking out landmarks I recognized, and began the slow, painful process of making my way back towards the ranger station. Every step was agony, and I had to stop frequently to rest and listen for any signs of pursuit. But as the sun rose higher, warming the chill forest air, I began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe I'd actually managed to lose them. That hope was shattered by the sound of voices, distant but growing closer. They were coming back, sweeping the area in the light of day. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I couldn't outrun them, not in my condition. I needed another plan. That's when I remembered the ravine. It was close by, a treacherous drop that we regularly warned hikers about. It was dangerous, but it was also my best chance. I changed direction, pushing through the pain in my ankle as I made for the ravine. I could hear the men getting closer, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. They sounded confident, sure they had me cornered. I reached the edge of the ravine just as I heard footsteps behind me. Without hesitation, I lowered myself over the edge, clinging to roots and outcroppings as I descended as quickly as I dared. "There she is," a voice shouted from above. "She's going down the ravine." I didn't look up, focusing all my attention on not falling. My hands were scraped and bleeding, my injured ankle screaming in protest, but I kept going. I could hear them above me, arguing about whether to follow. Halfway down, I found what I was looking for. A small ledge, hidden from view from above by an outcropping of rock. I maneuvered onto it, pressing myself against the cliff face and holding my breath. The sounds of pursuit stopped. They were looking for me, but from their vantage point, it would appear I had made it to the bottom of the ravine. "She can't have gotten far," one of them said. "Not with that leg. Let's go around, cut her off at the bottom." I listened as their voices faded, hardly daring to believe my luck, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. As soon as they realized I wasn't at the bottom of the ravine, they'd be back. With painstaking slowness, I began to climb back up. Every movement was agony, but the thought of capture, of what these men might do to me, kept me going. It felt like hours, but finally, I pulled myself back over the edge of the ravine. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, before forcing myself to my feet. The ranger station wasn't far now. I just had to make it a little further. I don't remember much of that final trek. Pain and exhaustion had reduced my world to putting one foot in front of the other. But suddenly, there it was. The ranger station, its solid wooden walls, the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I stumbled through the door, collapsing onto the floor as my colleagues rushed to my aid. Through tears of relief and pain, I managed to gasp out my story. The authorities were called, and a massive manhunt was launched. They caught the poachers 2 days later, trying to flee the state. It turned out they were part of a larger wildlife trafficking ring, one the feds had been trying to crack for years. As for me, well, I spent a few weeks in the hospital, recovering from my injuries and the ordeal. Some folks thought I'd want a desk job after that, maybe move to a nice, safe city post. But the truth is, I couldn't wait to get back to my forest. Those woods had been my prison for one terrifying night, but they'd also been my salvation. I know their secrets now, the darkness that can lurk in their depths. But I also know their beauty, their strength. And next time I hear the trees whisper, you can bet I'll be listening. Story 12. The darkness of the cave swallowed us whole, but it wasn't the lack of light that terrified me. It was the growing certainty that we weren't alone down here, and whatever was with us was ancient, hungry, and awakening. My name's Alex, and I've been a cave guide for Holler Mountain tours for the past 5 years. I've always loved the thrill of exploring the underground, the way the darkness seems to pulse with secrets just waiting to be discovered. But that day, as I led a group of tourists into the depths of Shadowfall Cavern, I had no idea we were about to uncover a secret base left buried. Our group was small, just 6 tourists plus me. There was the Johnsons, a middle-aged couple celebrating their anniversary. Mike and Sarah, college students on a weekend adventure. Tom, a gruff older man who seemed more interested in the geology than the excitement. And Emily, a quiet woman who hung at the back of the group, her eyes wide with a mix of wonder and apprehension. The tour started like any other. We entered through the main cavern, its vast ceiling disappearing into darkness above us. I pointed out formations, explained the cave's history, cracked the usual jokes about not waking the bats. Everything was going smoothly. It wasn't until we reached the narrow passage known as the squeeze that things started to feel off. As we shuffled through single file, our headlamps casting jumping shadows on the rough stone walls, I felt a change in the air. It was subtle at first, just a slight drop in temperature, a faint smell like ozone. "Hey, did you feel that?" Sarah asked as we emerged into a larger chamber. I nodded, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah, there's often a temperature drop in this section. It's why we call it the icebox." But even as I said it, I knew this was different. The cold had a biting edge to it, and there was a heaviness to the air that I'd never experienced before. We pressed on, deeper into the cave system. With each step, that sense of wrongness grew stronger. The familiar formations seemed somehow altered, twisted into shapes that hurt the eye to look at directly. And the silence. Caves are never truly silent, but now even the constant drip of water seemed muted, as if the very stone around us was holding its breath. It was Tom who spotted it first. "What's that over there?" he asked, pointing his headlamp towards a dark crevice in the far wall. I frowned. I knew every inch of this cave system, but I'd never noticed that opening before. "Probably just a shadow," I said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. As we approached, it became clear that this was no trick of the light. There was a passage there, narrow but definitely real, and carved around its edges were symbols unlike anything I'd ever seen. Twisting, alien glyphs that seemed to writhe in the beam of our headlamps. "This isn't on the tour map," Mrs. Dorshanson said, a nervous edge to her voice. "No," I admit, "it's not. I should have turned us around right then. Should have led the group back to the surface and called in an expert team to investigate. But curiosity, that same drive that had led me to become a cave explorer in the first place, got the better of me." "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Just a quick look. The passage was tight, forcing us to go single file. The walls were slick with some kind of oily substance that our lights couldn't quite penetrate. And the smell that ozone sent from earlier was stronger now, mixed with something earthier, almost rotten. We emerged into a vast chamber, so large our headlamps couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. But it wasn't the size that took our breath away. It was what filled it. Structures rose from the cave floor, twisted spires of stone that couldn't have formed naturally. They were covered in the same writhing symbols we'd seen at the entrance. And at the center of it all was something. A massive shadow darker than the surrounding darkness. pulsing slowly like a giant alien heart. What? What is this place? Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, a low rumble filled the chamber. At first, I thought it was a cave-in starting, but then I realized the sound was coming from that central mass. It was moving, unfurling like some monstrous flower. "We need to leave," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm even to my own ears. "Now." But as we turned to go, our headlamps flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. Panic set in immediately. I could hear the ragged breathing of the group around me, punctuated by Sarah's quiet sobs. "Everyone stay calm," I called out, fumbling in my pack for the emergency flares. "I've got light." The flare sputtered to life, casting an eerie red glow over the chamber. For a moment, I wished it hadn't, because now we could see clearly what was awakening before us. It was vast, its form constantly shifting as if it couldn't quite decide what shape to take. Tentacles, wings, grasping hands, all appeared and disappeared in a nauseating display, and its eyes. God, its eyes. Hundreds of them, opening all across its roiling surface, fixing us with an alien intelligence that felt older than time itself. A scream tore through the chamber. I think it was Mrs. Dawson, but in that moment of pure terror, it could have been any of us. We ran, scrambling back towards the narrow passage. I could hear something behind us, a sound like stone grinding on stone mixed with a high-pitched keening that set my teeth on edge. We burst out of the passage, not stopping as we raced through the familiar parts of the cave. My mind was reeling, unable to process what we'd seen. This couldn't be real. Things like that didn't exist. Couldn't exist. But the terror was real enough, driving us forward, even as our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. I led the way, praying that my instincts and years of experience would guide us back to the surface. We were about halfway to the exit when the first tremor hit. The ground shook beneath our feet, sending loose rocks clattering down around us. "It's coming," Tom gasped. "Oh God, it's coming for us." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was just a coincidental earthquake, but I knew better. Whatever we'd awakened down there was stirring, and the whole cave system was feeling its effects. We pressed on, the tremors growing stronger and more frequent. In the icebox chamber, a massive stalactite crashed down just feet from where Mike was standing. The narrow squeeze felt even tighter, the walls seeming to press in around us as we shuffled through. Finally, blessedly, I saw light ahead. Real light, sunlight filtering in from the cave entrance. We were almost there. That's when the loudest rumble yet shook the cave. I heard a crack and looked up to see the ceiling starting to give way. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Sarah and Mike ahead of me. We burst out of the cave entrance just as a massive cave-in started behind us. Rocks and dust billowed out after us as we collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. For a long moment, no one spoke. We just lay there, feeling the warm sun on our faces, hardly daring to believe we'd made it out alive. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "What? What was that thing?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? In the days that followed, as authorities questioned us and geologists examined the no-sealed cave entrance, I struggled to make sense of what we'd encountered. The others seemed eager to rationalize it away. A shared hallucination brought on by bad air, they said. A trick of the light and overactive imaginations. But I knew better. I'd felt the age of that thing, the alien intelligence in its gaze. And sometimes, Late at night, I swear I can still hear it. That grinding, keening sound, like something massive stirring in the depths of the earth. The cave system remains closed, officially due to unstable conditions, but I know the truth. We wakened something down there, something that was never meant to be disturbed. And even though the entrance is sealed, I can't shake the feeling that it's still down there, waiting, watching. And one day, when the stars awry or the earth shifts just so, it will find its way out. And God help us all when it does. I don't guide cave tours anymore. Can't bring myself to go underground, not after what I saw. But I keep watch. Because someone has to be ready. Someone has to remember. The darkness is patient. And what sleeps beneath the mountain is only dreaming. Story 13. The storage unit door slid open with a metallic groan, revealing a nightmare I never could have imagined. In that moment, I realized that the true horrors of this world aren't always locked away in distant places. Sometimes they're hiding just down the street, behind a simple padlock and a rental agreement. My name's Mike, and I've been working night security at EZ's Tor self-storage for about 6 months now. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays the bills and gives me plenty of quiet time to work on my novel. At least, that's what I thought until last Tuesday night, when everything I thought I knew about the worlds turned upside down. The shift started like any other. I arrived at 10 p.m., did my first round of checks, then settled into the small office to watch the security monitors and tap away at my laptop. The facility was quiet, as usual. Most people don't access their storage units in the middle of the night, which is why we only need one guard on duty. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something odd. I was doing my hourly check of the camera feeds when I saw a flicker of movement on one of the screens. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. These cameras aren't exactly top of Allen, but then I saw it again, clearer this time. Someone was moving around in the corridor of Block C now. Night access isn't strictly forbidden at EZ Store, but it's unusual enough to warrant checking out. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out to investigate. The night was cool and damp, a light fog rolling in from the nearby river. My footsteps echoed off the rows of identical metal doors as I made my way to Block C. As I turned the corner, I half expected to see some poor soul wrestling with an overstuffed unit, maybe doing some late-night decluttering. What I saw instead stopped me in my tracks. The door to Unit C-137 was open, just a crack. But that wasn't what sent a chill down my spine. It was the noises coming from inside. A low, steady hum punctuated by what sounded like whimpering. I approached cautiously, my hand hovering over the radio at my belt. "Hello," I called out. "This is security. Is everything all right in there?" The humming stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice, raspy and strained. "Help, please." Training kicked in, overriding the fear that was trying to route me to the spot. I pushed the door open wider, shining my flashlight into the unit. The beam illuminated a scene straight out of a horror movie. The unit had been converted into some kind of makeshift laboratory. Strange equipment lined the walls, bubbling vials and sparking electrical devices, casting eerie shadows. And there, strapped to a table in the center of it all, was a person. At least, I thought it was a person at first. But as my light played over their form, I realized with growing horror that whatever was on that table wasn't entirely human anymore. Their skin was a patchwork of different textures and colors, as if pieces had been grafted on from multiple sources. One arm was grotesquely elongated, ending in claw-like fingers, And their face. God, their face. It was a twisted mass of flesh, with multiple eyes blinking at me from impossible angles. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the metal door of the opposite unit. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in real life, and certainly not in a run-of-the-mill storage facility in suburban Ohio. The thing on the table stirred, straining against its restraints. "Please," it rasped again, in a voice that sounded like multiple people speaking at once. "End this." I should have run. Should have called the police, the FBI, anyone. But something in those pleading, inhuman eyes held me in place. Whatever this creature was, it was suffering. And on some level, it was still human enough to ask for help. With shaking hands, I approached the table. The straps holding the creature down were simple leather. Whoever had done this hadn't expected their subject to be discovered. I fumbled with the buckles, trying not to look too closely at the twisted flesh beneath my fingers. As the last strap came loose, the creature let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a sob. It tried to sit up, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. I reached out to help, pushing aside my revulsion to support its malformed shoulders. "Thank you," it whispered, its multiple eyes fixing on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "But you need to go." "He'll be back soon." "Who?" I asked, even as part of me screamed that I didn't want to know the answer. "Who did this to you?" Before the creature could respond, a new sound cut through the night. Footsteps, approaching quickly. The creature's eyes widened in terror. "Hide!" it hissed, pushing me towards a large storage cabinet. I hesitated for a split second, torn between the urge to help and the very real fear of whoever was coming. But self-preservation won out. I squeezed into the cabinet just as the unit's door swung fully open. Through a crack in the cabinet door, I watched as a man entered. He was tall and thin, with wild grey hair and eyes that gleamed with a manic intensity. He wore a lab coat, splattered with stains I didn't want to identify. Well, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "How did you get loose, my dear?" "No matter. We have so much more work to do." The creature on the table let out a low moan. "No more," it pleaded. "Please, just let me die." The man tisked, like a parent scolding a child. Now. You know we can't stop now. We're so close to perfection. Just a few more adjustments." He turned to a nearby workbench, reaching for a scalpel. My stomach churned as I realized what was about to happen. I couldn't just sit here and watch. But what could I do against this madman? As if sensing my thoughts, the creature's eyes found mine through the crack in the cabinet. There was a silent plea in them, a desperate need for this nightmare to end. In that moment, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I burst out of the cabinet with a yell, tackling the surprised scientist to the ground. The scalpel clattered across the floor as we grappled, rolling amongst the bizarre equipment. The man was stronger than he looked, driven by a manic energy. He clawed at my face, screaming about ruined experiments and the pursuit of perfection. I fought back with everything I had, knowing that if I lost, I'd likely end up on that table myself. In our struggle, we knocked over a table of equipment. Glass shattered, and suddenly the air was filled with acrid smoke. Alarms began blaring, the fire suppression system kicking in. Through the chaos, I saw the creature rising from the table. It moved with a newfound strength, purpose evident in its twisted features. Before I could react, it had grabbed the scientist, lifting him with inhuman strength. "No more," it growled, in that multi-layered voice. And then, To my horror and relief, it snapped the man's neck with a sickening crack. The creature turned to me, its eyes sad but determined. "Thank you," it said, "but you need to go. Now, this all needs to end." I stumbled to my feet, coughing in the thickening smoke. "Come with me," I pleaded. "We can get you help." It shook its head, a grotesque parody of a smile twisting its features. "There's no help for me. But I can make sure this never happens to anyone else." As if to emphasize its point, it knocked over another table, sending more chemicals spilling across the floor. The small fires that had started were growing, feeding on the spilled liquids. I wanted to argue, to try and save this poor, twisted being. But one look in its eyes told me it had made its decision. With a heavy heart, I turned and ran, bursting out of the unit into the cool night air. Behind me, I heard a roar. Whether of pain or release, I'll never know. The fire spread quickly, engulfing Block C in a matter of minutes. By the time the fire department arrived, there was nothing left but twisted metal and ashes. I told the police a sanitized version of events that I had discovered in a legal lab, struggled with a scientist, and barely escaped the fire. They seemed skeptical, but with no evidence left in the wreckage, they had little choice but to accept my story. It's been 3 weeks since that night. I've quit my job at the storage facility for obvious reasons. I can't sleep without seeing those pleading, inhuman eyes, or hearing that multi-layered voice begging for release. I don't know what that scientist was trying to achieve in that storage unit. I don't know how many others he might have experimented on before I stumbled upon his work. But I do know that there are horrors in this world far beyond what most people can imagine. And sometimes, the greatest mercy we can offer is an end to suffering. Every time I pass a storage facility now, I can't help but wonder, what secrets are hiding behind those seemingly innocent metal doors? What nightmares are waiting to be discovered? And most chillingly of all, how many other storage units, in how many other towns, might be hiding similar horrors? The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening for the sound of footsteps or the low hum of experimental machinery. Because now I know the truth. The monsters aren't just in our stories. Sometimes they're right next door, hidden behind a simple padlock and a monthly rental fee. Story 14. The moment I read the first line of that ancient text aloud, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The air in the library grew thick and heavy, and in the shadows between the bookshelves, something stirred. Something that should have remained forgotten. My name is Eleanor, and I've been the head librarian at the Millbrook Public Library for nearly 2 decades. It's a quiet job in a quiet town, and I've always loved being surrounded by books, by the countless stories and secrets held within their pages. But I never imagined that one of those secrets would turn my world upside down and plunge me into a nightmare I'm still not sure I'll wake up from. It all started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The library was emptier than usual, the patrons likely deterred by the gloomy weather. I was cataloguing a recent donation of books from the estate of old Mr. Hawthorne, a reclusive collector who'd lived on the outskirts of town. Most of the books were unremarkable, dusty old novels and outdated encyclopedias. But then I came across a volume that made me pause. It was bound in what looked like leather, but the texture was all wrong. Too smooth, almost scaly to the touch. There was no title on the spine or cover, just a series of intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change if I looked at them too long. My curiosity piqued. I opened the book. The pages were made of some kind of parchment, yellowed with age, but still surprisingly supple. The text was handwritten in a spidery script, alternating between languages I recognized: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and others I'd never seen before. Scattered throughout were diagrams and illustrations that made my eyes hurt to look at, all angles and proportions subtly wrong. I should have closed the book right then. Should have locked it away and called someone. A university, a museum, anyone with more expertise than a small-town librarian. But the words seemed to call to me, daring me to decipher their secrets. I began to read, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. The air around me grew heavy, charged with a kind of electric potential. And then, as I finished the first paragraph, the lights flickered. I looked up, startled out of my reverie. The library seemed darker than it had been a moment ago, the shadows between the bookshelves deeper and somehow more alive. A chill ran down my spine as I realized. I could no longer hear the rain pattering against the windows. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled. "Is anyone there?" No response. But as I listened, I became aware of a new sound. A low, rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heart beating somewhere in the depths of the building. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly in the unnatural silence. The book slipped from my lap, landing on the floor with a thud that seemed to echo forever. And in that echo, I heard something else. Whispers, countless voices speaking in languages I couldn't understand. Panic began to set in. I turned to run, to get out of the library and call for help. But as I reached the end of the aisle, I stopped short. The layout of the library had changed. Where there should have been a clear path to the exit, there was now an endless maze of bookshelves, stretching out farther than the building's walls should have allowed. I turned back, intending to return to my desk and the fallen book. Maybe if I closed it, read the words backwards, I could undo whatever I'd started. But my desk was gone. In its place was a plain wooden door that I knew hadn't been there before. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from behind that door, calling to me in voices that were at once alluring and terrifying. Against my better judgment, I found myself reaching for the handle. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. The pulsing sound I'd heard earlier was stronger here, reverberating through the stone steps. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something deeper, more primal, urged me forward. I began to descend, one hand trailing along the damp stone wall for balance. The air grew colder with each step, and I could have sworn I felt something brush against my skin, tendrils of mist, or perhaps something more solid. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that twisting passageway. But eventually I emerged into a vast chamber that should not, could not, have existed beneath the library. The room was circular, its walls lined with bookshelves that reached up into a darkness my eyes couldn't penetrate. In the center was a pedestal, and on that pedestal, glowing with an inner light, was the book I'd been reading. As I approached, I saw that the book was open, its pages turning on their own as if blown by an unfelt wind. The whispers I'd heard earlier now filled the chamber, rising and falling like waves against a shore. I reached out to touch the book, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. As my fingers brushed its pages, the whispers suddenly coalesced into a single voice, deep, resonant, and utterly inhuman. At last, it said, the words bypassing my ears and echoing directly in my mind. A reader. I jerked my hand back, but it was too late. The glow from the book intensified, and I felt a tugging sensation, as if something was trying to pull me into the pages. "What are you?" I gasped, struggling against the invisible force. The voice chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. We are the forgotten, the erased, the stories that were never meant to be told. And you, dear librarian, have given us voice once more. The tugging grew stronger, and I felt my feet leave the ground. Pages from the book began to swirl around me, each one containing glimpses of impossible worlds and terrifying creatures. "No," I shouted, grasping desperately for something to anchor me. "I don't want this." "It matters not what you want," the voice replied. "The story has begun, and you are now a part of it." Just as I thought all was lost, my hand closed around something solid, the edge of a bookshelf. I clung to it with all my strength, feeling as if I was being torn in two. In that moment of desperation, a memory surfaced. Something I'd read long ago about the power of stories, about how they could be shaped by their tellers. If this was a story, then maybe... "No," I said, forcing as much conviction into my voice as I could muster. "This is not how the story goes." The tugging faltered, just for a moment. I pressed on, the words coming faster now. "This story is about a librarian who found a book, who read it, yes, but who closed it again, who put it back on the shelf where it belonged." I felt my feet touch the ground again, the swirling pages slowing their frantic dance. "This is a story," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "about respecting the power of words. About understanding that some secrets are meant to stay hidden." The voice howled in frustration, but I could feel its power waning. The room around me began to shimmer and fade, like a mirage in the desert. "And most of all," I said, as the bookshelves melted away and I found myself back at my desk in the familiar confines of the Millbrook Public Library, "this is a story about going home." The books slammed shut with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. For a long moment, I simply sat there, my heart pounding, hardly daring to believe it was over. Slowly, cautiously, I reached out and picked up the book. It felt different now, lighter somehow, and the symbols on its cover no longer seemed to move. With trembling hands, I wrapped it in brown paper and sealed it with packing tape. I wrote a simple note, "Return to sender," not meant for public circulation, and addressed it to the Hawthorne estate. Then I placed it in the outgoing mail bin, breathing a sigh of relief as it disappeared from view. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions of my job, shelving books and helping the few patrons who ventured out in the rain. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the impossible events over and over. As I locked up that evening, I paused at the door, looking back at the quiet rows of bookshelves. They looked so innocent, so familiar. But now I knew the truth, that within those pages lurked worlds and powers beyond imagination. I've been more careful since that day, more reverent of the books in my care, because now I understand that every story, every word, holds a kind of magic. Most of it is harmless, even beneficial. The magic of knowledge, of escape, of shared human experience. But some stories are better left untold. Some books are meant to stay closed. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the library is dark and empty, I sometimes think I can still hear them. Those whispers from beyond, calling out from between the pages, waiting for someone to give them voice once more. But not me, never again. Because now I know the true power of words, and the responsibility that comes with it. I am the guardian of these stories, both the light and the dark, and I intend to keep it that way. Story 15. The perfect shot was all I cared about. until I found myself trapped on an island where every click of my camera brought us closer to death. I never imagined a destination wedding could turn into a fight for survival, but here we were, hunted by something that shouldn't exist, with only my lens standing between us and oblivion. My name's Jake, and I've been a wedding photographer for the better part of a decade. I've shot ceremonies in every setting imaginable: beaches, mountaintops, even underwater once. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that unfolded on the shores of Blackwater Island. It started innocently enough. A wealthy couple, the Montgomerys, hired me to photograph their daughter's wedding on their private island off the coast of Maine. An all-expense paid week in paradise to capture the happy couple's special day. It seemed like a dream gig. The island was everything they promised. Pristine beaches, lush forests, and a sprawling mansion that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. As our boat approached the private dock, I couldn't help but feel a tingle of excitement. This was going to be a wedding album for the ages. The first few days were a whirlwind of preparation. I scouted locations, did engagement shoots with the bride and groom, and got to know the other guests. There were about 50 of us in total: family, friends, and a small army of staff to cater to our every need. It wasn't until the night before the wedding that I first sensed something was off. I was down at the beach, setting up for some sunset shots, when I heard it, a low, keening sound coming from the dense forest behind me. It wasn't any animal I recognized, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I mentioned it to one of the staff members, a local guy named Mike, who'd been working for the Montgomerys for years. He brushed it off, saying it was probably just some native bird species. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of unease that made me think he knew more than he was letting on. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. As I made my rounds, capturing candid shots of the bride getting ready and the groom nervously adjusting his tie, I pushed the strange sounds from my mind. I had a job to do, after all. The ceremony was picture perfect. I got shots of the bride walking down the aisle, framed by the setting sun, of the couple exchanging vows with the crashing waves as a backdrop. As the reception kicked into high gear, I allowed myself to relax a bit. Maybe this would just be a normal, if exceptionally luxurious, wedding after all. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was just after midnight when the screaming started. I was down by the water, taking some night shots of the illuminated mansion, when I heard it, a blood-curdling shriek that cut through the sounds of music and laughter from the ongoing reception. I sprinted back towards the house, my camera bouncing against my chest. The scene that greeted me was one of pure chaos. Guests were running in every direction, their faces masks of terror. And there, in the center of it all, was something. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid, but much larger, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. Its skin seemed to shift and ripple, sometimes resembling scales, sometimes fur. And its face, God, its face. Where there should have been features, there was only a writhing mass of tentacles. For a moment, I stood frozen, my photographer's instinct warring with my sense of self-preservation. Then the thing turned, fixing me with eyes that glowed an unnatural green, and I ran. The next few hours were a blur of terror and confusion. I found myself huddled in the mansion's wine cellar with a group of survivors. The bride and groom, a handful of guests, and Mike, the staff member I'd spoken to earlier. "What the hell is that thing?" the groom demanded, his voice shaking. Mike's face was ashen. It's something that's been on this island for generations. The Montgomery's ancestors made a deal with it long ago. Sacrifices in exchange for wealth and power. Sacrifices. The bride whispered, horror dawning on her face. You mean us? Mike nodded grimly. Usually it's just 1 or 2 people every few years. But a gathering this big, I think it got greedy. The reality of our situation sank in. We were trapped on an island with a monster, straight out of a Lovecraftian nightmare, cut off from any hope of rescue. As the night wore on, we could hear the thing moving through the house above us, the floors creaking under its impossible weight. Occasionally, a scream would pierce the air, quickly cut off, and our group would huddle closer together, trying not to imagine what was happening to those unlucky souls. It was the bride who first noticed something odd about my camera. "Jake," she whispered, pointing at the display. "Look." I glanced down and felt my blood run cold. In every shot I'd taken since the creature appeared, there was a strange distortion, a blurring around the edges of the frame, as if reality itself was warping. And in the background of each image, barely visible, was a shadowy form that I knew, with bone-deep certainty, was our hunter. That's when a crazy idea began to form in my mind. If this thing was some kind of eldritch horror, maybe it was vulnerable to being captured on film. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan we had. I shared my theory with the others. Mike looked skeptical, but the rest of the group latched onto the idea with desperate hope. We formulated a plan. I would act as bait, luring the creature into the open with my camera, while the others made a break for the boat. As dawn broke, we put our plan into action. I stepped out of the wine cellar, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the monster would hear it. The mansion was eerily silent, the opulent rooms now a wreckage of overturned furniture and, worse things I tried not to look at too closely. I made my way to the grand foyer, my camera at the ready. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I'm right here!" "Come and get me." For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it. That same keening sound I'd heard on the beach, but louder now, filled with hunger and rage. The chandelier above me began to sway, crystals tinkling ominously, and then it was there, looming at the top of the stairs, its form seeming to blur and shift as it moved. I raised my camera and started shooting, the flash strobing in the dim light. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The creature recoiled, letting out a shriek that shattered windows and sent pain lancing through my skull. But I kept shooting, my finger jammed down on the shutter release, capturing frame after frame of the impossible. With each shot, the thing seemed to become more solid, more real. And with that realness came vulnerability. It thrashed and howled, tentacles lashing out and smashing everything in reach. But it couldn't seem to approach me directly, as if the camera lens was projecting some kind of barrier. I backed towards the front door, still shooting. Outside, I could hear the sound of a boat engine roaring to life. The others had made it. Now I just had to get out myself. But the creature, in its death throes, had one last card to play. As I reached for the door handle, it let out one final, deafening shriek. The chandelier, already swaying dangerously, came crashing down. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as it missed me by inches. But my camera wasn't so lucky. I watched in horror as it was crushed beneath the mass of crystal and metal. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, the sound of something large moving towards me. I looked up to see the creature, no longer held at bay by my lens, advancing with a kind of terrible purpose. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But instead of the killing blow I expected, I felt a rush of wind. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, the foyer was empty. No monster, no evidence of the night's horrors beyond the general destruction. Outside, I could hear sirens approaching. The mainland authorities finally alerted that something was wrong. I staggered out onto the front steps, squinting in the bright morning light. Down at the dock, I could see the others, safe on the boat. They were waving at me, calling my name. As I made my way down to join them on shaky legs, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The creature was gone, yes, but not destroyed. Somewhere out there, in some realm beyond our understanding, it was waiting. And one day, it would be back. I reached the dock and practically fell into the boat, exhausted beyond belief. As we pulled away from Blackwater Island, I looked back at the mansion, now swarming with police and paramedics. To them, this would be a tragedy, a wedding gone horribly wrong, with no explanation for the carnage they'd find inside. But I knew the truth, and as I fingered the memory card I'd managed to save from my destroyed camera, I knew I had proof. The world might not be ready for what I'd captured, but someday they'd need to know. Because there are things out there in the dark, ancient and hungry, and sometimes the only thing standing between us and them is the power of seeing, truly seeing what lurks in the shadows. As the island faded into the distance, I made a silent vow. I'd keep shooting weddings, keep capturing those moments of joy and love. But I'd also be watching, waiting, my camera always at the ready. Because now I knew. Sometimes, the perfect shot isn't just about preserving a memory. Sometimes, it's about saving lives. Story 16. The Appalachian Trail was supposed to be my escape, a chance to find myself in the wilderness. Instead, I found something that defied explanation. A secret hidden in the heart of the mountains that would haunt me for the rest of my days. My name's Sarah, and I've always been drawn to the outdoors. After a particularly rough breakup and losing my job in the same week, I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail. Just me, my backpack, and 2,190 miles of pristine wilderness stretching from Georgia to Maine. It was going to be my fresh start, my grand adventure. For the first month, it was everything I'd hoped for. The physical challenge, the breathtaking views, the camaraderie with fellow hikers. It all worked to heal my battered spirit. I felt stronger, more alive than I had in years. It was somewhere in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee that things started to get weird. I'd been hiking alone for a few days, enjoying the solitude, when I first noticed a symbol. It was carved into the bark of a massive old oak tree just off the main trail. A simple design, a circle with a diagonal line through it, but something about it caught my eye. I didn't think much of it at first. Hikers often left marks or messages for those coming behind them. But as the days went on, I kept seeing that same symbol, always just off the main trail, always pointing deeper into the wilderness. My curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, instead of sticking to the well-worn path, I followed one of these markers. It led me to another, then another, creating a trail of its own that wound through some of the most rugged terrain I'd ever encountered. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, I emerged into a small clearing, and there, nestled against the base of a sheer cliff face, was a cabin. It looked ancient, its log walls weathered by countless seasons, but there was smoke curling from the chimney. I approached cautiously, equal parts intrigued and unnerved. As I got closer, I could make out more details. Strange symbols were carved into the door frame, similar to the ones that had led me here, but more complex. And hanging from the eaves were dozens of small objects, feathers, bones, crystals that clinked together in the breeze like an otherworldly wind chime. Before I could decide whether to knock or beat a hasty retreat, the doors swung open. An old woman stood there, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and clear as mountain streams. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice gravelly but strong. "Come on in, child. We've been expecting you." I hesitated, every instinct screaming that this was a bad idea. But something in her eyes, a mixture of kindness and ancient wisdom, made me step forward. The interior of the cabin was a single room, dimly lit by oil lamps and a crackling fire. Every surface was covered with books, jars of strange liquids and powders, and more of those intricate symbols. And there, seated around a rough-hewn table, were 3 more people. A middle-aged man with a wild beard, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, and a boy of about 12. They all turned to look at me as I entered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and, was that relief? "Welcome, seeker," the old woman said, guiding me to an empty chair. "We are the keepers of the way, and we've been waiting for you." What followed was a conversation that shook the very foundations of my reality. They spoke of ancient magics, of hidden paths through the mountains that led to places beyond my wildest imagination. They told me of a war waged in secret for centuries, between those who would protect the old ways and those who would exploit them for power. "The symbols you followed," the bearded man explained, "their waymarks, guides for those with the sight to see them. We left them hoping to find others like us, those who could sense the deeper truths of the world." I listened, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the ravings of some backwoods cult, but another part, a part that had always felt there was more to the world than met the eye, resonated with their words. "But why me?" I asked. "I'm nobody special. I'm just lost." The young woman smiled, reaching out to take my hand. "Being lost is the first step to being found," she said. "You have a gift, Sarah. You can see what others can't, feel what others don't. That's why the waymarks led you here. They offered to teach me, to show me the hidden ways of the mountains. And despite every rational thought screaming at me to run, to get back to the normal world of smartphones and 9-to-5 jobs, I found myself saying yes. The next few weeks were a blur of learning and discovery. They taught me to read the secret language of the forest, to find paths where none seemed to exist. I learned of healing herbs and protective charms, of rituals as old as the mountains themselves. But it wasn't all esoteric knowledge and magical secrets. There were very real dangers in these hidden places. More than once, we had to evade groups of armed men searching for the entrance to our hidden valley. The keepers called them breakers, those who sought to destroy the old magics for their own gain. One night, as we sat around the fire, the old woman, whose name I'd learnt was Elder, told me the true history of the Appalachian Trail. It was created as a shield, she said, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames, a way to hide the true paths in plain sight. Millions walk the trail every year, never knowing that just beyond their vision lies a world of wonder and danger. I thought of all the hikers I'd met in my first month on the trail, how oblivious they were to the deeper mysteries surrounding them. It made me feel special, chosen. but it also filled me with a profound sense of responsibility. As the weeks turned to months, I found myself becoming more and more a part of this hidden world. My old life, the breakup, the lost job, the aimless wandering, seemed like a distant dream. Here, I had purpose. Here, I belonged. But the peace couldn't last. One crisp autumn morning, as I was gathering herbs in a meadow near the cabin, I heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters. Moments later, gunshots echoed through the valley. I raced back to find the cabin in flames, breakers swarming the area. Elder and the others were fighting back with powers I still barely understood. Trees coming to life to entangle our attackers. The very earth opening up to swallow them whole. In the chaos, Elder pressed a small leather-bound book into my hands. "Run, child," she said, her eyes urgent. "Take the hidden paths. Find the other keepers. The knowledge must survive." I wanted to stay, to fight alongside them. But I knew my skills were no match for the breakers' weapons. With tears streaming down my face, I fled into the forest, following a path that seemed to appear before me as I ran. I ran for what felt like days, the sounds of battle fading behind me. The hidden paths took me through places that defied description, shimmering portals in ancient stone circles, caves that seemed to bend space and time. Finally, exhausted and heartbroken, I emerged from the wilderness. I found myself on a nondescript stretch of the Appalachian Trail, as if the past months had been nothing but a dream. But the book in my hands and the knowledge in my head told me it had all been terrifyingly real. In the years since, I've continued to hike the trail. To outsiders, I'd probably look like any other long-distance hiker. But my eyes are always scanning the trees for those hidden symbols. My feet always ready to step off the main path and into the unknown. I've found other keepers, shared the knowledge entrusted to me, and I've faced dangers that most people couldn't imagine in their worst nightmares. But I've also seen wonders that defy description, experienced magics that fill me with awe. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the forest is alive with secret whispers, I think back to that day I first saw the waymark carved into that old oak tree. I think about the life I left behind and the incredible journey that one simple symbol set me on. And I realized that while I set out on the Appalachian Trail to find myself, what I really found was a whole hidden world. A world I now have a duty to protect. Because out here in the wilderness, in the spaces between the marked trails and popular lookouts, there's magic. Real, wild, dangerous magic. So if you're ever hiking the Appalachian Trail and you see a symbol carved into a tree just off the path, think carefully before you follow it. Because once you step into that hidden world, there's no going back. The path you find might just lead you to wonders beyond imagination, or to dangers that could cost you everything. Story 17. I never thought a house could have a will of its own. But as I watched my patient's eyes glaze over with that alter-familiar madness, I realized we were trapped in a nightmare where the walls didn't just have ears. They had a hunger that could never be satisfied. My name is Claire, and I've been a home health nurse for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of difficult cases, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me at the Blackwood estate. When I first got the assignment, I was actually excited. A live-in position, caring for a wealthy, elderly patient in a beautiful country house. It seemed like a dream job. The house itself was impressive, a sprawling Victorian mansion set back from the road, surrounded by acres of overgrown gardens. As I drove up the winding driveway, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was old money, the kind of place you read about in Gothic novels. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, my patient, was a frail woman in her 80s. Her family had hired me to provide round-the-clock care as her health declined. When I first met her, she seemed pleasant enough, if a bit distant. Her eyes had a faraway look, as if she was constantly distracted by something I couldn't see. "You'll do nicely," she said after looking me up and down. "Just remember, dear, the house has rules. Break them at your peril." I laughed it off at the time, assuming it was just the ramblings of an old woman. God, I wish I'd taken her seriously. The first few days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, helping Mrs. Blackwood with her medications, preparing her meals, and assisting her around the house. But as time went on, I began to notice things, little oddities that were easy to dismiss at first, but which gradually became impossible to ignore. It started with the noises. At night, when the house should have been silent, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing on their own. When I'd go to investigate, I'd find nothing out of place, just empty corridors and closed doors. Then there were the changes in the house itself. I could have sworn that rooms moved overnight. A door that led to a bathroom one day would open onto a linen closet the next. Windows that I was sure overlooked the front garden would suddenly show a view of the backwoods. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses settle, I told myself. I was tired, working long hours in an unfamiliar place. My mind was playing tricks on me, but Mrs. Blackwood's behavior was harder to explain away. She would have periods of lucidity where she seemed sharp as a tack, followed by episodes of utter madness. During these episodes, she'd rave about the house being alive, about it whispering to her in the night. "It's hungry, Claire," she'd say, her eyes wild and unfocused. "So hungry. And where it's food." I did my best to comfort her, to convince myself that it was just the ramblings of a mind succumbing to dementia. But deep down, a part of me was starting to wonder if there might be some truth to her words. It was about 2 weeks into my stay when things really started to go off the rails. I woke up in the middle of the night to find Mrs. Blackwood standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "It's chosen you," she whispered, "just like it chose me all those years ago. I'm so sorry, my dear. I'm so sorry." Before I could respond, she turned and walked out of the room. I followed her, calling out, but when I stepped into the hallway, she was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I found myself facing a corridor I'd never seen before, stretching out far longer than the house's dimensions should have allowed. That was the moment I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that something was very, very wrong with this house. The next few days were a waking nightmare. The house seemed to be constantly shifting around us. Rooms would appear and disappear at will. Staircases would lead to different floors each time we climbed them. And all the while, I could feel something watching us, an unseen presence that seemed to pulse with malevolent hunger. Mrs. Blackwood's condition deteriorated rapidly. She oscillated between periods of catatonia and frenzied activity. During her lucid moments, she tried to explain. "The house, it feeds on us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On our fear, our confusion, our despair. It's been doing it for generations. My family. We're its caretakers, its providers. We lure people here, nurses, servants, guests, and it consumes them, body and soul." I wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a madwoman, but I couldn't. Not with what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. The constant disorientation, the growing sense of dread. The way my own thoughts seemed to scatter and reform in patterns I didn't recognize. It was all wearing me down, breaking me bit by bit. I tried to leave, of course, but every time I thought I'd found the front door, it would lead me to yet another unfamiliar room. My phone had no signal, and any attempts to contact the outside world were met with eerie silence. As the days blurred together, I found myself losing track of time. Had I been here for weeks, months, years? The windows showed a constantly shifting landscape. Sometimes the overgrown gardens, sometimes dense forests, sometimes vistas that couldn't possibly exist in our world. Mrs. Blackwood's moments of lucidity became rarer and rarer. Most of the time, she just sat in a chair, staring at the walls with a vacant expression. But sometimes, she'd snap to attention, her eyes clear and focused. "You have to break the cycle," she told me during one of these moments. "Find the heart of the house, destroy it. It's the only way to end this." But how could I find anything in this ever-changing labyrinth? And even if I did, how could I hope to destroy something that seemed to defy the very laws of reality? My chance came, if it was really chance and not the house toying with me, when I stumbled upon a hidden study. Unlike the other rooms, this one seemed stable, unchanging. The walls were lined with books, and at the center stood a pedestal holding a large, leather-bound tome. As I approached the book, I could feel the house's attention focusing on me. An almost palpable weight of malevolent anticipation. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing pages filled with arcane symbols and diagrams. I couldn't understand the language, but as I flipped through the pages, images filled my mind. Visions of the house throughout the ages, of countless victims lured in and consumed, of the dark rituals that had given it its power. And there, in the center of the book, I saw it, a diagram of the house's true form, a twisted, impossible shape that hurt my eyes to look at. At its core was a pulsing, dark mass that I somehow knew was the house's heart. In that moment, I understood what I had to do. The house had shown me its secrets, thinking me too broken to resist, too far gone to fight back. But it had underestimated the human will to survive. I tore the page from the book, ignoring the howl of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Following the diagram, I made my way through the shifting corridors, no longer letting the constant changes disorient me. I found Mrs. S. Blackwood in what had once been the living room, now transformed into a grotesque parody of itself. The furniture twisted into organic, pulsing shapes. "You've seen it," she said, her eyes clear for the first time in days. "You know what must be done." I nodded, helping her to her feet. Together, we made our way to the center of the house, to a room that pulsed with dark energy. And there it was, the heart, a writhing mass of shadow and malevolence. What happened next is a blur in my memory. There was fire, I know that much. Fire and blood and words in a language I didn't understand, but somehow knew how to speak. Mrs. Blackwood and I, the last of the house's victims, turning its hunger against itself. I remember the house screaming, the walls melting around us, reality itself seeming to tear at the seams. And then, nothing. I woke up in a field of ash and rubble, Mrs. Blackwood's lifeless body beside me. Of the house itself, there was no sign. Just a scorched patch of earth where it had once stood. The authorities didn't believe my story, of course. As far as they were concerned, there had been a tragic house fire, with me as the sole survivor. Sometimes, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I can still feel it. The hunger, the malevolence, the patient evil that waits in forgotten places. And I wonder, was it really destroyed? Or is it out there somewhere, rebuilding itself, waiting for new victims to feed its insatiable appetite? All I know is that I'll never look at old houses the same way again. Because sometimes, the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones that hide under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes, they are the house itself, patient and hungry, waiting for unsuspecting souls to walk through the door and into their grasp. Story 18. The moment the engine died, I knew we were in trouble. But as the fog rolled in and that other boat appeared, I realized that being stranded was the least of our worries. Some things shouldn't be encountered on open water, especially when there's nowhere to run. My name's Mike, and I've always loved the water. So when my friends Jake and Sarah suggested we rent a houseboat for a long weekend on Lake Champlain, I jumped at the chance. We'd been planning this trip for months, a much-needed break from our hectic city lives. The first day was perfect. We cruised along the shoreline, taking in the beautiful scenery, swimming in secluded coves, and enjoying a few beers as the sun set. As night fell, we anchored in a quiet bay, far from any other boats or signs of civilization. We were in the middle of a heated game of cards when we first noticed something was off. The gentle rocking of the boat had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. Jake went to check the weather radio, but all he got was static. "That's weird," he muttered, fiddling with the dial. It was working fine earlier. I stepped out onto the deck to take a look around. The night was unusually dark, the stars and moon obscured by a thick blanket of clouds, and it was quiet. Too quiet. No lapping of waves against the hull, no chirping of insects from the shore. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, a wall of fog rolling towards us across the water. But this wasn't any normal fog. It moved with purpose, tendrils reaching out ahead of it like grasping fingers. "Guys," I called out, trying to keep the alarm out of my voice. "You might want to see this." Sarah and Jake joined me on the deck, and we watched in stunned silence as the fog enveloped our boat. Within seconds, we couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Maybe we should start the engine," Sarah suggested, her voice tight with barely contained panic. "Get to shore before this gets worse." I nodded, heading to the helm. But when I turned the key, all I got was a sickening click. The engine was dead. "This isn't happening," Jake muttered, running his hands through his hair. Boats don't just die like this. We spent the next hour trying everything we could think of to get the engine started. But it was like all the life had been drained out of it. Even the emergency radio and our cell phones were useless, showing no signal. As we debated our next move, a sound cut through the fog, the low, mournful tone of a boat's horn. We rushed to the railing, straining our eyes to see through the murk. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there? We need help." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, emerging from the fog like a ghost ship, came another boat. It was old, far older than any vessel I'd expect to see on the lake. Its wood was weathered and grey, and tattered sails hung limply from its masts. But it wasn't the boat's appearance that sent a chill down my spine. It was the fact that it was moving steadily towards us without any visible means of propulsion. There was no sound of an engine, no wind to fill its sails. It was as if an invisible hand was pushing it through the water. As it drew closer, We could make out figures on its deck. They were wrong somehow. Too tall and thin, their movements jerky and unnatural, and their faces. I'll never forget those faces as long as I live. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched tight over elongated skulls, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Get inside," I whispered urgently, pushing Sarah and Jake towards the cabin. Now, we huddled inside, peering out through the windows as the ghostly ship pulled alongside our houseboat. A gangplank thudded down, connecting the two vessels. And then they started to board. Their movements were fluid yet wrong, like watching a film played at slightly the wrong speed. As they stepped onto our boat, I could hear a sound. A low, rhythmic chanting in a language I'd never heard before, but which filled me with a sense of primordial dread. "What do they want?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, one of the creatures pressed its face against the window. Its eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I felt like I was falling into an abyss of madness. Images flashed through my mind. Ancient cities beneath the waves, rituals performed in the depths of lightless caverns, and always, always, that haunting chant. I don't know how long I was lost in that vision. When I came back to myself, I was on my knees, Sarah and Jake shaking me frantically. "Mike, snap out of it," Jake was saying, his voice edged with panic. I blinked, trying to clear my head. We need to get out of here," I managed to say. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was hopeless. The creatures were all around the boat now, their chanting growing louder. The fog seemed to be thickening, pushing in on us from all sides. That's when Sarah had an idea. "The flare gun," she said suddenly. "It's in the emergency kit. Maybe if we signaled for help." It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Jake retrieved the flare gun while I kept watch through the window. The creatures hadn't tried to enter the cabin yet, but I had a feeling it was only a matter of time. With shaking hands, Jake loaded the flare and stepped out onto the deck. The chanting stopped abruptly, and all those glowing eyes turned to focus on him. For a moment, everything was still. Then Jake raised the flare gun and fired. The red light streaked upwards, momentarily piercing the fog. And in that brief illumination, we saw the truth of our situation. We weren't on the lake anymore. The water around us was vast and dark, stretching out to a horizon that shouldn't have been visible. And in the distance, silhouetted against the fading light of the flare, were the spires of a city that had no place in our world. The creatures reacted to the flare with inhuman shrieks. They retreated to their ship, their movements now frantic and jerky. As the last of them crossed the gangplank, their vessel began to move away, fading into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. For a moment, we stood in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just seen. Then, as if some spell had been broken, our engine roared to life. The fog began to dissipate, and suddenly we were back on Lake Champlain, the familiar shoreline visible in the distance. We didn't waste any time. I gunned the engine, heading for the nearest marina as fast as the houseboat would go. None of us spoke during that journey. What was there to say? When we finally reached shore, we were met by a search and rescue team. Apparently, our flare had been spotted, and they'd been looking for us all night. According to them, we'd been missing for 3 days. We tried to tell them what had happened, but the words sounded hollow and unbelievable, even to our own ears. In the harsh light of day, with solid ground beneath our feet, it all seemed like a bad dream. But I know what we saw, what we experienced. And sometimes, Late at night, when the moon is hidden and the water is still, I swear I can hear that chanting again, carried on a wind that shouldn't exist. We don't go out on the water anymore. My friends and I, we've seen what lurks beneath the surface of our reality, the things that wait in the spaces between worlds. And we know that sometimes, when the conditions are just right, the veil between those worlds can thin. So if you're ever out on a lake, and the fog rolls in thicker than it should, and you hear the sound of an old boat's horn, don't answer. Don't even look. Just get to shore as fast as you can. Because there are things out there in the dark waters, ancient and hungry, and they're always looking for new souls to join their crew. And if you see a light in the fog, a single red flare streaking across the sky, well, just hope it's not us, still lost out there, trying to find our way home. Story 19. The first body we found was just the beginning. As I descended into the abandoned mine, I realized that the darkness hiding beneath our quiet town went far deeper than any shaft or tunnel. Some secrets, once unearthed, can never be buried again. My name's Jack Hawthorne, and I've been a detective in the small town of Millbrook for going on 15 years. It's usually a quiet place. A few domestic disputes, the occasional drunk and disorderly, maybe a burglary now and then. But nothing could have prepared me for the case that would shake our community to its core and make me question everything I thought I knew about the place I called home. It started with a missing person report. Sarah Jenkins, a local college student, hadn't been seen in 3 days. Her roommate was worried sick, saying it wasn't like Sarah to disappear without a word. We took the report seriously, but at first, we thought it was probably just a case of a young woman blowing off some steam, maybe taking an unannounced trip with friends. But then we found her car. It was parked at the edge of town, near the entrance to the old Blackstone mine. The mine had been closed for decades, ever since a collapse in '85 that killed a dozen workers. These days, it was just a hole in the ground that parents warned their kids to stay away from. As I stood there, looking at Sarah's abandoned car, a chill ran down my spine. That had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. Something was very wrong here. We organized a search party, focusing on the area around the mine. It was on the second day of searching that one of the volunteers made the grisly discovery. A body, half buried in a shallow grave just inside the mine's entrance. My heart sank as we carefully excavated the site. But as the corpse was revealed, I realized 2 things. First, this wasn't Sarah Jenkins. And second, whoever this poor soul was, they'd been dead for a lot longer than a few days. The body was that of a young man, probably in his early 20s. And based on the state of decomposition, our medical examiner estimated he'd been dead for at least a year. As we widened our search, we found more graves. 2, then 5, then a dozen. Some were recent, others had clearly been there for years, maybe even decades. Men, women, young, old. There seemed to be no pattern to the victims, except that none of them were local. These were outsiders, people who wouldn't be missed in a small town like Millbrook. The case exploded overnight. State police and FBI agents descended on our little town, and suddenly Millbrook was making national headlines. But even with all the extra manpower, we were no closer to finding Sarah or identifying our killer. That's when I got the anonymous tip. A voice on the phone, distorted and nervous, telling me to look into the history of the Blackstone family, the original owners of the mine. "It goes deeper than you know," the voice said before hanging up. I spent days digging through old records, piecing together the history of the Blackstones and their mine. What I found chilled me to the bone. Rumors of dark rituals performed in the depths of the earth. whispers of sacrifices made to ensure the mine's productivity, and always, stories of people going missing. But the truly terrifying part, the Blackstones weren't some long-gone family from the town's past. Their descendants were still here, still holding positions of power in Millbrook. As I dug deeper, I started to notice things. The way certain people in town would clam up when the mine was mentioned. The nervous glances exchanged between council members when the investigation was discussed. And the strange symbols I'd begun to see around town, carved into trees, painted on the sides of buildings, always in places you'd miss if you weren't looking for them. I knew I was onto something big, something that went beyond a simple serial killer. But I also knew that if I was right, I couldn't trust anyone in town. Not my fellow officers, not the mayor, not even my own neighbors. That's why, on a cold Tuesday night, I found myself standing at the entrance to the Blackstone mine, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my service weapon. I knew it was stupid, knew I should wait for backup. But I also knew that Sarah Jenkins, if she was still alive, was running out of time. The entrance to the mine was like a gaping maw, ready to swallow me whole. As I stepped into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight seemed pitifully inadequate against the pressing blackness. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. I made my way deeper into the mine, following the main shaft. The walls were lined with strange symbols, similar to the ones I'd seen around town, but more complex, more alive somehow. It felt like they were watching me, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I came to a fork in the tunnel. One path continued straight ahead, while the other sloped downward at a steep angle. As I stood there, trying to decide which way to go, I heard it. A faint sound coming from the lower tunnel. It might have been my imagination, but it sounded almost like chanting. Heart pounding, I started down the sloping path. The chanting grew louder as I descended, accompanied now by a rhythmic drumming that seemed to vibrate through the very rock around me. And underneath it all, barely audible, I thought I heard a woman's voice, pleading. Desperate. Sarah. I picked up my pace, caution warring with the need to help. The tunnel opened up into a vast cavern, dimly lit by flickering torches. And there, in the center of it all, was a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. A group of robed figures stood in a circle, their faces hidden by grotesque masks. In the center of the circle was an altar, and strapped to that altar was Sarah Jenkins, her eyes wide with terror. One of the figures stood over her, a wickedly curved knife raised high. I didn't think. I just acted. Police. Freeze! I shouted, my voice echoing off the cavern walls as I leveled my gun at the knife wielder. For a moment, everything was still. Then all hell broke loose. The robed figures scattered, some fleeing deeper into the cave system, others rushing towards me. I fired off a warning shot, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. It was enough to make them hesitate, giving me the chance to race to the altar. Sarah was barely conscious, her wrists and ankles bloody from where she'd struggled against her bonds. As I worked to free her, I became aware of a new sound, a low rumbling that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. We need to go, I said urgently, helping Sarah to her feet. Now, we stumbled towards the exit, the rumbling growing louder with each step. Behind us, I could hear shouts of panic from the cultists. Whatever was happening, it had them scared too. We were halfway up the sloping tunnel when the first tremor hit. The ground bucked beneath our feet, sending us sprawling. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling. "Come on!" I yelled, pulling Sarah to her feet. "We're almost there." We ran, the tunnel collapsing behind us in a roar of falling rock and twisting metal. We burst out of the mine entrance just as a massive cave-in swallowed it whole, a cloud of dust billowing out after us. As we stood there, gasping for breath, I became aware of flashing lights and sirens. A group of state police cars was pulling up, lights blazing. Someone must have heard the gunshot and called it in. In the days that followed, the full extent of what had been happening in Millbrook began to come to light. The cult, it turned out, had roots going back generations. Many of the town's most prominent citizens were involved, believing their rituals kept the town prosperous. The mine collapse buried a lot of evidence, but we found enough in the cultists' homes and in town records to put most of them away for a long time. Sarah's testimony was the final nail in that coffin. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that we only scratched the surface of what was really going on in that mine. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that chanting, carried on the wind from the direction of the collapsed mine entrance. And every now and then, I see one of those symbols carved into a tree or painted on a wall. A reminder that some darkness can never truly be erased, only buried, waiting for someone to unearth it once again. Millbrook is quiet these days, almost too quiet. But I know better now. I know that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones hiding in plain sight, in the quiet towns where nothing ever seems to happen. And I know that as long as I'm here, I'll keep watching, keep digging. Because someone has to make sure that darkness stays buried. At least, for now. Story 20. The moment I realized we were being hunted, I knew this was no ordinary wilderness survival course. As the shadows between the trees seemed to move with a life of their own, I understood that our fight for survival had become all too real. My name's Alex, and I've been a wilderness survival instructor for the better part of a decade. I've led countless groups through some of the most challenging terrains North America has to offer. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what happened during that ill-fated expedition in the Cascade Mountains. It was supposed to be a routine 5-day course. 6 students, all eager to learn the basics of surviving in the wild. We had Jane, a middle-aged accountant looking to challenge herself. Mike and Sarah, a young couple who dreamed of extended backpacking trips. Tom, a gruff ex-military type. Lisa, a college student with a passion for ecology. And Dave, a quiet guy who seemed more interested in escaping civilization than learning survival skills. The first 2 days went smoothly. We set up camp in a beautiful valley, practiced fire-starting techniques, learned how to identify edible plants, and went over basic first aid. The group was bonding well, swapping stories around the campfire each night. It felt like countless trips I'd led before. It was on the 3rd day that things started to feel off. We were doing a navigation exercise, with the group split into pairs to find their way back to camp using map and compass. I was making my rounds, checking on each team's progress, when I first sensed something was wrong. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. And there was something else, a scent on the air that I couldn't quite place. Musky, wild, unlike anything I'd encountered before. I was about to radio the groups and tell them to head back to camp when I heard it. A scream, distant but unmistakable, cut off abruptly. My blood ran cold. That had sounded like Lisa. I ran towards the source of the sound, my heart pounding. As I crashed through the underbrush, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Something large, moving far too quickly for a bear or any other animal I was familiar with. I found Lisa's backpack first, torn and bloodied, its contents scattered across a small clearing. Of Lisa herself, there was no sign. But the ground told a story that made my skin crawl. Massive tracks, vaguely humanoid but much too large, and claw marks gouged deep into the bark of nearby trees. My first instinct was to call for help, to get my students out of there as quickly as possible. But when I tried my satellite phone, all I got was static. We were on our own. I spent the next hour rounding up the rest of the group, my senses on high alert for any sign of whatever it was that had taken Lisa. By the time we were all back at camp, the sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees. Shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. "What's going on, Alex?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Where's Lisa?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my own fear from showing. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're not alone out here. Something took her, and I think it might be hunting us." I explained what I'd seen, what I'd heard. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief in their eyes slowly give way to fear. All except for Tom, whose hand had strayed to the large hunting knife at his belt, his eyes scanning the Trillin with a steely determination. "So what's the plan?" he asked gruffly. "We can't just sit here waiting to be picked off." He was right, of course, but our options were limited. It was almost dark. We were miles from the nearest road. And there was something out there that seemed to know these woods far better than we did. "We'll fortify the camp," I decided. "Build up the fire, set some alarms around the perimeter. In the morning, we'll make for the ranger station. It's about a day's hike from here." We worked quickly, gathering extra firewood, setting up noise traps with what gear we had. All the while, I could feel eyes on us, watching from the deepening gloom beyond our firelight. None of us slept much that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us starting up, peering into the darkness, but nothing approached our camp. It was as if whatever was out there was content to wait, to let our fear and exhaustion wear us down. As dawn broke, we quickly broke camp and set out for the ranger station. I took point, with Tom bringing up the rear. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, driven in a specific direction by our unseen hunter. It was around midday when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dave, who had been growing increasingly panicky, broke into a run. "Dave, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. He disappeared into a thick stand of trees. For a moment, there was silence. Then we heard his scream, abruptly cut off, just like Lisa's had been. "Run!" I yelled, abandoning all pretense of stealth. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, moving far faster than anything that size should be able to. A dark shape glimpsed from the corner of my eye, massive and terrifyingly swift. We burst into a small clearing, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we'd been led into a trap. Sheer cliff faces rose on three sides, leaving us nowhere to go but back the way we'd come, back towards whatever was hunting us. "Form a circle," Tom barked, his military training kicking in. Backs to each other. Whatever this thing is, we face it together. We huddled in the center of the clearing, armed with nothing but our knives and makeshift spears fashioned from tree branches. The growling grew louder, and then it emerged. I've spent years in the wilderness, encountered bears, mountain lions, wolves. But this was something else entirely. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to shift between humanoid and bestial forms. Its skin was a patchwork of fur and scales, and its face. God, its face. A muzzle filled with razor-sharp teeth, eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was terrifyingly alien. It stalked towards us, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. As it drew closer, I could see patterns on its skin, symbols that looked unsettlingly similar to some of the native petroglyphs I'd seen in the area. "What the hell is that thing?" Mike whispered, his voice cracking with fear. I shook my head, unable to speak. This creature defied explanation, defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was Tom who acted first. With a yell, he charged forward, his knife flashing in the sunlight. The creature moved with impossible speed, swatting Tom aside like he was nothing more than an annoying insect. He hit the cliff face with a sickening crunch and crumpled to the ground, unmoving. Sarah screamed, the sound seeming to agitate the creature further. It roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath our feet, and lunged forward. What followed was a chaos of screams, blood, and desperate struggle. I fought with everything I had, my knife scoring several hits, but it was like trying to fight a force of nature. One by one, my students fell. I don't know how long the battle lasted. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that blood-soaked clearing. But suddenly, I found myself alone, facing the monster that had decimated my group. It towered over me, blood dripping from its claws, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. I waited for the killing blow, my body tensed for one final, futile attempt at defense. But it didn't attack. Instead, it spoke. The words weren't in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood them. It spoke of ancient pacts broken, of boundaries crossed, of a balance upset by human encroachment. And it spoke of a test, a culling to determine who was worthy to know the secrets of the deep wilds. With a jolt, I realized that this hadn't been about simple predation. We had been judged, tested, and I somehow had passed. The creature stepped back, gesturing towards the forest with one massive, clawed hand. An invitation, or a command. I looked back at the clearing, at the broken bodies of my students. Then, driven by a compulsion I couldn't understand, I stepped forward, following the creature into the shadows between the trees. I don't know how long I wandered those woods, guided by the shape-shifting entity. Time and space seemed to twist and bend, and I saw wonders and horrors beyond imagination. When I finally emerged, I was miles from where we'd entered, with no sign of the creature. The authorities found me 3 days later, dehydrated and babbling about monsters in the woods. They found the bodies of my students too, eventually. The official report blamed a bear attack. After all, what other explanation could there be? I don't lead wilderness courses anymore. Can't bring myself to go back into those deep forests. But sometimes, on the edge of town, I see symbols carved into trees. Symbols that look unsettlingly familiar. And I wonder about the secrets still hidden in the wild places of the world, and about the guardians that keep those secrets safe. Because now I know the truth. We're not alone out there in the wilderness. And sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones with claws and fangs. Sometimes, they're the ones who forget that we're guests in a world far older and stranger than we can imagine.